The Last Dynasty. China's history unfolds like an unbroken thread of dynasties stretching back millennia. Xia, Shang, Zhou, Qin, Han, Tang, Song, Yuan, Ming, and finally, the Qing. Each dynasty bore its own character: the Zhou's ritual refinement, the Han's consolidation of empire, the Tang's cultural brilliance, the Song's bureaucratic sophistication, the Mongol-born Yuan's foreign rule, and the Ming's return to Han tradition. Into this tapestry of rule came the Qing, the last imperial dynasty, whose reign would span nearly 3 centuries, from 1644 to 1912, and leave an indelible mark on the shape of modern China. The Qing emperors were not ethnically Han Chinese, but Manchus, a people from the forested lands of Northeast Asia, known historically as Manchuria. Their ancestors, semi-nomadic Jurchen tribes, reorganized under the leadership of Nurhaci in the early 1600s, forging the 8 banners military and social system that bound Manchu identity to martial prowess and clan loyalty. By 1636, Nurhaci's son Hong Taiji renamed their realm Qing and prepared to cross the Great Wall into the heart of the Ming Empire. China under the Ming was riddled with internal crisis, fiscal shortfalls, corruption in the court, peasant uprisings, and the threat of flooding Yellow River dikes. In 1644, rebel leader Li Zicheng captured Beijing, prompting the Ming general Wu Sangui to open the gates to the Manchu banners rather than see the city pillaged by rebels. Thus, the Qing moved swiftly into the capital, proclaiming themselves rightful heirs to the mandate of heaven. Yet the Qing were more than conquerors. From the outset, they recognized the challenges of ruling the vast, complex civilization they had seized. They adopted Confucian rites, maintained the civil service examination system, and preserved Han institutions while introducing the banner system into governance. Emperors like Shunzhi and Kangxi demonstrated genuine respect for Chinese scholarship and ritual. They patronized Confucian academies, compiled vast state histories, and consulted with Han officials on legal reforms. This dual identity, Manchu conquerors yet preservers of Chinese tradition, became the defining feature of Qing rule. Under Kangxi and his grandson, Qianlong, the dynasty reached the height of territorial expansion, absorbing Taiwan, Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet into a multi-ethnic empire. At the same time, Kangxi's sponsorship of the Kangxi Dictionary and Qianlong's commissioning of the massive Siku Quanshu literary corpus underscored a commitment to Chinese learning and culture. Throughout their rule, the Qing navigated the tensions of cultural fusion. Court rituals combined Manchu horseback archery and hunting ceremonies with Chinese sacrificial rites. Official edicts were issued in Manchu and Chinese. Eunuchs and Buddhist lamas shared influence with Confucian scholar officials. This synthesis enriched Chinese society, but also carried seeds of strain as population boomed, fiscal demands rose, and officials grappled with the costs of maintaining such a vast empire. Over time, these strains surfaced as the dynasty entered a long period of decline, challenged by internal rebellions, natural disasters, and mounting external pressures. The initial theme of expansion gave way to questions of sovereignty, when foreign powers sought trade privileges and territorial concessions. Cultural fusion turned ambivalent as Manchu-Han distinctions re-emerged under pressures of modernization, and the early narrative of preserving tradition was contested by reformers who demanded constitutional limits on imperial power. Yet, as we embark on this journey through the Qing era, it is vital to remember the dynasty's achievements alongside its failures. The Qing emperors helped shape modern China's frontiers, fostered monumental art and architecture, from the summer palace's mirrored lakes to the Forbidden City's golden halls, and preserved a vast literary heritage, even as they governed an empire of unprecedented diversity. Their decline, culminating in the Revolution of 1911 and the abdication of the child Emperor Puyi, closed the chapter on 2,000 years of imperial rule. But their legacy lives on in China's population distribution, cultural practices, and the very maps that define the nation's borders. Over the next 12 chapters, we will trace the Qing dynasty's journey, from Nurhaci's unification of the Manchu tribes and the fall of the Ming, through the triumphant reigns of Kangxi and Qianlong, the challenges of opium wars and internal rebellions, to the cautious self-strengthening movements, the scramble for foreign concessions, and the final gasp of reform before the dynasty's collapse. We will listen for the echoes of Manchu horse hooves in Beijing's courtyards, feel the flicker of lanterns in Qing palaces, and sense the tension between ancient rites and modern ideas as China hurtled toward its 20th century transformation. In this last dynasty, we find a civilization at once rooted in tradition and buffeted by change, an empire whose story holds lessons for any age. The Manchus and the fall of the Ming. At the turn of the 17th century, the northeastern forests and grasslands beyond the Great Wall were home to a confederation of Yurchen tribes, later known as Manchus, living in scattered villages along the Amur River. These semi-nomadic peoples sustained themselves by hunting, fishing, and tending small fields, organized into kinship clans. Their warriors rode sturdy horses, practiced archery, and held seasonal festivals celebrating the hunt and the cycles of sun and moon. Yet it was a weaker period for China's Ming dynasty, embroiled in court intrigues, heavy taxes, and mounting natural disasters, that allowed these border tribes to transform into an empire's undoing. The pivotal figure in this transformation was Nurhaci, born in 1559 into the Isin-Joro clan. A skilled hunter, noted for his intelligence and charisma, Nurhaci first served as a minor Ming military officer, learning Chinese siegecraft and administrative methods. By the early 1600s, sensing Ming weakness, he launched campaigns against rival Yurchen clans, uniting them under his leadership. In 1601, his followers formalized their loyalty through the creation of the Eight Banners system, a revolutionary social-military organization dividing all Manchu households into color-coded military units, each responsible for governance, recruitment, and battlefield readiness. Under this banner structure, Nurhaci combined martial discipline with hereditary status, forging a cohesive Manchu identity. In 1616, Nurhaci declared the establishment of the later Jin state, evoking the Qing dynasty of centuries past, and proclaimed himself Khan. Adopting Chinese titles and ceremonial practices, he signaled both continuity with Chinese imperial traditions and a distinct Jurchen authority. Over the next decade, the Jin armies, now reinforced by Chinese defectors and equipped with captured firearms, launched a series of swift conquest campaigns against neighboring tribes and Ming frontier garrisons. Cities like Fushun and Ningyuan fell under siege, and Ming forces, undermanned and plagued by corruption, struggled to respond effectively. Behind these northern incursions, the Ming heartland was crumbling. Decades of lavish palace spending, costly military expeditions against Mongols, and rampant eunuch corruption had drained the imperial treasury. Peasants, burdened by heavy land taxes and forced labor for flood control projects, rebelled in provinces across the empire. In the 1620s and 1630s, bandit armies, most notably those led by the charismatic Li Zicheng, rose in western Shanxi and Hubei, rallying starving villagers to their cause. Famine, exacerbated by unusually cold winters and epidemic illness, drove desperate families to join these rebels, swelling their ranks. Meanwhile, the Ming court's attempts at reform came too late. In 1627, the Yongzheng emperor ascended the throne as the last Ming ruler. Though personally dedicated, he inherited an exhausted bureaucracy plagued by factionalism. His efforts to purge corrupt officials and rebuild revenues met with resistance, and each crackdown further alienated talented administrators. By the late 1630s, the situation was dire. Ming garrisons along the Great Wall reported mutinies, grain shipments to the capital dwindled, and court coffers lay nearly empty. Sensing opportunity, Nurhaci's son and successor Hong Taiji pressed the Jin invasions into Liaodong and later struck deeper into Ming territory. In 1644, Li Zicheng's rebel forces reached Beijing itself, overrunning the capital and prompting the Chongzhen emperor, fearing capture, to commit suicide on Coal Hill. His bodyguards fled, the imperial palace was looted, and the Ming throne stood vacant. At this critical moment, the Ming general Wu Sangui, stationed with his troops at Shanhai Pass, faced a fateful choice. Support the peasant rebels who had upended his dynasty or ally with the Manchu banners poised at the frontier. Choosing the latter, he opened the gates to the Jin forces, allowing Hong Taiji's banners and Chinese defectors to enter Beijing unopposed. Within weeks, the Jin seized the Forbidden City, declared the founding of the Qing Dynasty, and installed the Shunzhi emperor as China's new sovereign. Thus, the rise of the Manchu tribes under Nurhaci's leadership, the establishment of the later Jin state, and the concerted conquest campaigns combined with the Ming dynasty's internal turmoil, corruption, rebellions, and fiscal crisis, to bring about one of the most dramatic regime changes in Chinese history. In the coming years, the nascent Qing rulers would transform from frontier conquerors into guardians of the Middle Kingdom's vast traditions, laying the groundwork for an imperial order that, despite future challenges, would endure longer than any dynasty before it. By the early 1640s, the Ming dynasty was teetering on the brink of collapse. Discontent simmered across China's countryside as heavy taxation, forced labor for flood control, and rampant corruption drove peasants into rebellion. Among the most formidable of these uprisings was led by Li Zicheng, a former minor Ming official turned agrarian rebel whose charismatic leadership and promises of equal fields attracted tens of thousands of followers. Li's army, hardened by years of hardship, pursued a swift campaign that carved a path through Shaanxi, Henan, and Shandong, toppling weak garrisons and recruiting disaffected soldiers along the way. In April of 1644, Li Zicheng's forces reached the outskirts of Beijing. The capital, protected by the massive walls of the inner and outer cities, appeared impregnable. Yet within its corridors of power, chaos reigned. The last Ming emperor, Chongzhen, faced a court divided by intrigue, unable to muster adequate troops or funds to repel the rebels. Supply convoys from the south were diverted or ambushed. Veteran commanders distrusted one another, and the imperial treasury lay nearly empty, its coffers drained by decades of mismanagement. On April 24th, Li Zicheng's banner troops launched their assault. Using captured artillery from walled towns, they breached the outer city gates and poured into the streets. Despite fierce resistance by palace guards and hastily conscripted militiamen, the rebels rapidly overwhelmed the defenders. The smoky haze of burning homes mingled with the cries of soldiers and civilians as the city fell into Li's hands. Inside the Forbidden City, the Chongzhen emperor hastily prepared to defend his throne. When he saw the gates overrun and his hopes of relief dashed, he climbed Coal Hill behind the palace and, in despair, took his own life, becoming the first Chinese emperor in 2 millennia to commit suicide rather than surrender. With the Ming court shattered, Li Zicheng proclaimed himself emperor of the new Shun dynasty, issuing edicts promising land reform and tax relief, but his victory was short-lived. News of Beijing's fall spread rapidly to the north, reaching the Manchu banners massed beyond the Great Wall under the young Shunzhi emperor and his regents. The Manchus, heirs of Nurhaci's later Jin state, had prepared for such a moment. In Shanhai Pass, where the Ming general Wu Sangui commanded the strategic garrison, Li's forces laid siege. But their rebel leaders' promises did little to win over professional soldiers who feared disorder more than foreign conquerors. Wu Sangui faced a fateful decision: submit to agrarian rebels who had upended the established order, or invite the disciplined Manchu banners into the heart of China to restore stability. Viewing Li Zicheng as a barbarian usurper and believing the Manchus could be controlled through alliance, Wu Sangui opened the gates of Shanhai Pass in late May 1644. Manchu cavalry and infantry, organized by the Eight Banners system, poured into the plains. In a decisive engagement on June 4th, the combined Manchu-Ming forces routed Li Zicheng's rebels at the Battle of Shanhai Pass. Li's army, undisciplined and fatigued, collapsed under the banners' coordinated musket volleys and cavalry charges. Li himself fled southward, leaving his dreams of a peasant utopia behind. Following their victory, the Manchu banners advanced on Beijing. Entering the capital unopposed, they took formal control of the imperial precincts, repairing walls and restoring order amid the devastation. In October 1644, the Shunzhi emperor, just 6 years old, was enthroned in the Forbidden City, marking the formal establishment of Qing rule. Grand ceremonies fused Manchu rituals with Confucian court protocol. The young emperor performed sacrifices at the Temple of Heaven, wore Chinese silk robes, and received the homage of Han officials who pledged loyalty under the imperial Sea of Banners. Yet the Qing would not simply impose foreign customs. They maintained the civil service examinations in Chinese classics, preserved local magistrates, and co-opted former Ming elites into provincial administration. Their rule combined the firmness of Manchu military tradition with careful accommodation of Chinese institutions, preserving the cultural heritage of their new subjects, even as they solidified control. The events of 1644 thus stand as one of the most dramatic turning points in Chinese history. Li Zicheng's rebellion exposed the Ming's fatal vulnerabilities, while Wu Sangui's decision at Shanhai Pass and the subsequent Manchu entry into Beijing brought about the rise of the Qing Dynasty. In the span of a few hectic months, the Middle Kingdom passed from a shattered Ming court to the hands of Manchu rulers who would govern as China's last imperial dynasty. An era of conquest, adaptation, and centuries-long rule that reshaped the contours of Chinese civilization. Consolidation, Shunzhi and Kangxi emperors. With the Manchu banners firmly in Beijing, the new Qing rulers faced the daunting task of transforming a foreign conquest into a stable dynasty. The Shunzhi emperor, enthroned as a child in 1644 under the regency of powerful nobles like Dogon, turned first to stamping out pockets of Ming loyalist resistance in southern China. Coastal Fujian, Guangdong, and the mighty Yangtze Basin became theaters of protracted guerrilla warfare. Ming princes raised armies of bandits and disgruntled scholars, fortified walled cities, and appealed to local elites for support. Qing generals, many of them defected Han officers recruited into the banner system, led disciplined campaigns against these holdouts. They combined brutal sieges with offers of amnesty. Garrisons that surrendered swiftly could keep their land or avoid execution. These policies, though ruthless at times, gradually eroded the will to resist. By the early 1660s, major southern centers like Guangzhou and Nanjing had fallen, and surviving Ming loyalists either fled into the mountains or integrated into Qing rule. This pacification laid the groundwork for China's reintegration under a single banner. Central to the Qing's military and social order was the refinement of the Eight Banners system, Originally devised by Nurhaci, the banners organized Manchu clans, and later Han and Mongol households, into color-coded units, plain and bordered yellow, white, red, and blue, that served as both military regiments and administrative communities. Under Shunzhi and his regents, the banner system expanded, allotting land, stipends, and hereditary ranks to thousands of soldiers and their families. Banner troops were housed in garrison towns, becoming the backbone of Qing military dominance, and trained year-round in horsemanship, archery, and musketry. Their presence across the empire signaled that the Manchu regime would not be overthrown lightly. In 1661, the 4-year-old Shunzhi emperor died unexpectedly, ushering in the reign of his third son, Xuanye, who would rule as the Kangxi emperor from 1661 to 1722, an astonishing 61 years, and the longest reign of any Chinese monarch. Kangxi ascended the throne at age 7, guided by regents at first, but by his teens he began to assert his own authority. Recognizing the importance of both Manchu identity and Chinese legitimacy, he embarked on a series of initiatives that would secure Qing rule for generations. First, Kangxi moved with extraordinary decisiveness to extinguish the revolt of the three feudatories, 1673 to 1681. Three southern warlords, former Ming generals rewarded by the Qing with provincial fiefs in Yunnan, Guangdong, and Fujian, rebelled, fearing Kangxi's consolidation of power would strip them of their autonomy. The emperor personally inspected banners and green standard army units, delegating capable lieutenants like the Han General Wu Sangui's grandson to besiege rebel strongholds. After 8 brutal years of campaign, during which the rebels ravaged the countryside and drew on local support, Kangxi's forces prevailed. This victory not only eliminated a potent threat, but also demonstrated the Qing government's commitment to centralized authority. Kangxi then turned his attention to Mongolia and the western frontiers. He led an expedition into the Altin-Tagh region, negotiating suzerainty over the Mongol tribes and integrating them into the banner system. Through a combination of marriage alliances with Borjigin princesses, trade agreements, and military garrisons, he secured control of Inner and Outer Mongolia, extending Qing dominion over the steppe and protecting China's northern flank. Simultaneously, Kangxi invested heavily in Chinese cultural and intellectual projects to strengthen the dynasty's legitimacy. He commissioned the Kangxi Dictionary, a monumental work cataloging over 47,000 characters, ensuring standardized script for scholars and government officials. He ordered the compilation of the imperially commissioned History of the Ming, a balanced chronicle that both honored Confucian tradition and framed Ming misrule as justification for Qing succession. His patronage of scholars and poets, many of whom were Han literati, fostered a spirit of cooperation. Confucian officials found a place in the Qing court, provided they demonstrated loyalty to the emperor. Kangxi's reign was not without challenges. Natural disasters such as floods and famines tested imperial relief efforts, and Jesuit missionaries at court introduced Western knowledge, astronomy, cartography, and mathematics, that sometimes clashed with traditional court ritual. Yet Kangxi embraced many Jesuit innovations, commissioning accurate star charts and a new calendar that blended Chinese and Western astronomical methods. This openness to pragmatic learning further burnished his reputation as a wise and benevolent ruler. By the end of Kangxi's reign in 1722, the Qing dynasty had shed its status as a conquering regime and emerged as a confident multi-ethnic empire. Its armies were disciplined and loyal, its scholars were productive and integrated into governance, and its frontiers were secured from Manchuria to Mongolia. The consolidation achieved under Shunzhi and perfected by Kangxi would carry the Qing dynasty into its golden age, under Yongzheng and Qianlong. Yet even as Kangxi ruled, he sowed the seeds of future challenges in population growth and court factionalism. Still, His accomplishments stand as a testament to what a young emperor could achieve when blending martial tradition, administrative reform, and cultural patronage into a singular vision of imperial authority. By 1673, the fledgling Qing Empire faced its sternest test yet, the revolt of the three feudatories. These powerful regional lords, Wu Sangui in Yunnan and Guizhou, Shang Kexi in Guangdong, and Geng Jinggong in Fujian, had been granted vast fiefs as rewards for their roles in Qing conquest. Over time, fearful that the young Kangxi emperor would strip away their privileges, they rebelled in concert, plunging southern China into widespread unrest. Kangxi, then in his early teens, rose to the challenge. He reorganized banner troops, enlisted Green Standard Army units manned by Han soldiers, and appointed loyal generals such as Wu Shifan, a distant relative of Wu Sangui, as governors under strict orders. Central to the suppression strategy was divide and conquer. Kangxi alternately offered amnesty to wavering commanders and launched targeted offensives against hardened rebels. Riverine transport along the Yangtze allowed Qing forces to outflank rebel fortresses, while flaming barges broke enemy blockades guarding mountain passes. The emperor personally inspected camps at Yangzhou and Hangzhou, demonstrating both concern for troop welfare and willingness to share hardship. His orders mandated minimal collateral damage to civilian populations, a move that won over local gentry and commoners weary of rebel depredations. Within 8 years, each feudatory was isolated. Shang Kexi and Geng Jinggong surrendered under generous terms in 1676, absorbing their troops into Qing service. Wu Sangui fought on until 1681, when surrounded at Mount Wuhua, his army collapsed. His young grandson, Wu Shifan, committed suicide, and the last rebel banners surrendered their arms. The revolt's suppression was a turning point. It extinguished the greatest threat to Qing authority on Chinese soil and demonstrated the dynasty's capacity for ruthless but calculated governance. It also accelerated the integration of southern provinces into standard Qing administration. Provincial governors replaced hereditary princes, local militias disbanded, and tax systems were unified under the central government. The message was clear. No vassal, however powerful, could challenge the mandate of heaven embodied in the Qing throne. With the southern flank secured, Kangxi turned to the empire's periphery. Taiwan, then controlled by Ming loyalist Zheng Chenggong's heirs, had served as a refuge for anti-Qing elements and a hub for maritime trade and piracy. In 1683, Kangxi dispatched Admiral Shi Lang with a fleet of warships and thousands of soldiers. Landing at Penghu, the Pescadores, Shi Lang forced Zheng Keshuang, the young Ming prince holding Taiwan, to capitulate. The island was formally annexed into Fujian province, ending decades of maritime resistance and opening the way for Qing administration to establish garrisons, tax offices, and immigration controls. Chinese settlers soon streamed across the strait, cultivating rice paddies and building coastal defenses. Meanwhile, the vast grasslands of Mongolia, home to numerous Chinggisid Khans, posed both opportunity and risk. Their nomadic cavalry could threaten northern China, but also offered valuable allies against external threats. In the 1680s, Kangxi embarked on a series of campaigns and negotiations to bring Mongol tribes under Qing suzerainty. He convened the Torgut and other Oirat leaders at the Kurlen River, offering trade privileges, titles, and imperial marriage alliances with Ice-Nguro princesses. Qing banners were stationed at key passes, ensuring rapid military response if rebellions flared. By 1691, at the Assembly of Dolon Nor, the Khalkha Mongol princes formally recognized the Qing emperor as their liege, placing their yellow banner troops under imperial command. In return, Kangxi confirmed their local autonomy within Qing structures. He then launched expeditions westward to subdue the Dzunga Khanate, a rival Oirat power securing control of present-day Xinjiang's eastern fringes, though full conquest of Dzungaria would peak in the next century. These twin expansions into Taiwan and Mongolia moved the Qing Empire from a conquest state to a multi-ethnic continental power. Taiwan's fertile soils and strategic ports enriched the southern provinces, while Mongol alliance secured China's northern frontier and opened routes into Central Asia. Kangxi's blend of military force with diplomatic marriage, cultural tolerance, and religious patronage, including support for Tibetan Buddhism among Mongols, fostered stability over vast territories. By the end of Kangxi's reign in 1722, the Qing Dynasty had crushed internal rebellion, swept pirates from the seas, and woven disparate peoples into its imperial tapestry. The empire now stretched from Manchuria across Mongolia and down to Taiwan's shores, a realm whose unity rested on the emperor's ability to blend Manchu martial tradition with Chinese bureaucratic sophistication and flexible frontier diplomacy. The consolidation achievements of Shunzhi and Kangxi would stand as the foundation for the High Qing eras of Yongzheng and Qianlong, golden years that would see China reach the zenith of its territorial reach and cultural confidence. High Qing, Yongzheng, and Qianlong eras. When the Kangxi emperor passed in 1722, he left a vast and stable empire to his son Yongzheng, who ruled as the Yongzheng emperor until 1735. Though his reign lasted a mere 13 years, Yongzheng's impact on Qing governance was profound. He inherited an administration where provincial officials often acted with too much autonomy, allowing corruption to flourish in remote areas. Determined to strengthen central power, Yongzheng launched a series of reforms aimed at efficiency, accountability, and streamlined decision-making. First, Yongzheng overhauled the fiscal system. He ordered a comprehensive land survey, known as the Yellow Book Reform, to reassess taxable acreage and correct decades-old underreporting by local magistrates. By linking grain revenues directly to accurate land measurements, the state stabilized its income and reduced peasant burdens caused by arbitrary surcharges. He also restructured the granary network. Surplus rice stored in times of plenty was redistributed more swiftly during famines, curbing local unrest and demonstrating imperial care for the people. Yongzheng tackled bureaucratic corruption by creating a secret palace memorial system. Scholars and lower-rank officials could report malpractices directly to the throne, bypassing provincial hierarchies. In this way, Yongzheng gained a clearer picture of grassroots conditions and swiftly dismissed or punished corrupt magistrates, even those backed by powerful factions. Eunuchs and Manchu princes who had grown too influential under Kangxi were also disciplined, ensuring that only merit and loyalty guided advancement. To further boost administrative efficiency, Yongzheng reduced overlapping jurisdictions. He clarified the responsibilities of the 6 boards: personnel, revenue, rights, war, justice, and works, and instructed each provincial governor to focus on local issues rather than engaging in broader court politics. Annual performance reviews evaluated officials on tangible metrics: tax collection, public works completed, and social order maintained. Provinces that excelled received praise and promotions. Those that lagged saw salaries cut and posts revoked. Yongzheng's reforms extended into the intellectual sphere as well. He commissioned compilations of Confucian classics and legal codes, ensuring that provincial magistrates had standardized reference materials. At court, he solicited advice from Han Chinese scholars and Manchu nobles alike, fostering an environment where expertise, rather than lineage alone, guided policy. This emphasis on practical scholarship would influence his successor and cement a tradition of informed governance. When Yongzheng died in 1735, his son Hongli ascended the throne as the Qianlong emperor. Qianlong inherited an empire whose internal structures had been tightened and whose coffers were healthy. His reign, stretching until 1796, marked the zenith of Qing territorial expansion. Under Qianlong's leadership, Qing armies and diplomats extended imperial control deep into Central Asia and solidified China's claim over border regions. In the northwest, the Dzunga Khanate, an Oirat Mongol federation that had resisted Qing overtures, proved the principal obstacle. Between 1755 and 1758, Qianlong dispatched campaigns combining banner cavalry, green standard soldiers, and surrendered Mongol troops. The Qing forces gradually overwhelmed Dzungar strongholds in the Ili Basin, routing their armies and besieging their fortified camps. In a ruthless finale, Qing commanders pursued fleeing Oirats across the steppes, resulting in the near annihilation of the Dzungar state. By 1759, the Qing had annexed Dzungaria, establishing the region as Western Xinjiang province, and initiating resettlement policies that brought Han, Hui, and other ethnic groups into the formerly sparsely populated territory. Simultaneously, Qianlong turned his attention to Tibet. After a succession crisis among the Dzungas placed a hostile regime in Lhasa, the emperor sent an expedition in 1720 to expel Dzunga forces. Qianlong's envoy later negotiated the appointment of the 7th Dalai Lama, reaffirming the Qing as protector of Tibetan Buddhism. Although Tibetan nobles retained significant autonomy, Qing garrisoned forces at Lhasa, and the appointment of ambans, imperial residents, cemented Manchu oversight. Qianlong sponsored the rebuilding of Potala palaces and major monasteries, investing imperial funds to underscore the dynasty's role as patron of Tibetan religion. Beyond military conquest, Qianlong cultivated cultural patronage to legitimize his rule. He commissioned the compilation of the vast Siku Quanshu, a 4-department library of every important Chinese work, affirming the Qing as guardians of Chinese civilization. Traveling inspection tours across the empire showcased Qing benevolence. He visited southern canals, northern frontiers, and eastern cities, engaging with local elites, hearing petitions, and making modest repairs to infrastructure. These tours reinforced the image of the emperor as a hands-on ruler devoted to the welfare of all subjects. Yet even at its apex, the High Qing era harbored emerging strains. Massive population growth, territory-wide garrison costs, and lavish court expenditures began to strain the treasury. Corruption reappeared as local officials exploited remote regions. The cultural fusion that had unified Manchu and Han under Kangxi and Yongzheng now risked fracturing under the weight of modernization challenges from European powers on the coast. Nonetheless, the Yongzheng and Qianlong emperors laid the foundation for Qing stability and grandeur. Their combined legacies, administrative reform, centralized authority, and unprecedented territorial expansion, ensured that for much of the 18th century, the Qing dynasty reigned as one of the world's great empires, its domain stretching from the tropical islands of Taiwan to the high plateaus of Tibet and the arid deserts of Xinjiang. In the calm radiance of the High Qing era, China reached its largest size and cultural zenith, setting the stage for both its eventual challenges and its enduring heritage. Under the long and luminous reign of the Qianlong Emperor, China experienced a remarkable cultural flowering. As military campaigns secured new frontiers, the court's attention turned inward to harness and celebrate the civilization's intellectual riches. Painters in the imperial workshops produced exquisitely detailed bird and flower scrolls, landscape albums, and court portraiture that blended song realism with Manchu vibrancy. Ceramic kilns in Jingdezhen crafted porcelain vases and teawares, delicately painted with cobalt blues and overglaze enamels, destined to fill palace banquets and trade chests bound for Europe. Literary activity reached equally grand heights. Qianlong himself was a prolific poet. By some counts, he penned more than 40,000 poems, ranging from personal reflections on moonlit evenings to praise of military victories. Under his patronage, scholars compiled the complete library of the Four Treasuries, Siku Quanshu, the largest book collection in Chinese history. Over 10,000 scribes and editors labored for a decade to collect, categorize, and in many cases, censor or annotate some 3,500 works of philosophy, history, literature, and science. The resulting anthology, 8,000 volumes arranged into classics, Jing, histories, Shai, philosophies, Zi, and belles lettres, Ji, cemented the Qing dynasty's role as custodian of China's written heritage. This era also witnessed the production of the Gujin Tushu Jicheng, an encyclopedic compendium that filled 5,044 volumes and covered subjects from astronomy and geography to medicine and ritual. Scholars drew upon regional gazetteers, local histories, maps, and oracle classics to create a reference work so vast it rivaled Europe's Enlightenment encyclopedias. Meanwhile, advances in printing, woodblock replication refined with brighter inks and finer paper, allowed the dissemination of these works among elite circles, spreading knowledge to provincial academies and scholar officials far from Beijing. In the realm of the fine arts, court painters such as Giuseppe Castiglione, an Italian Jesuit who adopted the name Lang Shining, introduced Western techniques of perspective and shading, integrating them into traditional ink and wash landscapes. His collaborations with Chinese masters produced hybrid works, mountains rendered with realistic light and shadow, figures posed in Baroque repose, yet framed by Chinese calligraphy and poetic colophons. These cross-cultural creations embodied Qianlong's vision of an empire open to useful knowledge, while rooted firmly in Confucian and Manchu traditions. Such cultural efflorescence depended on stability and resources. Between 1700 and 1800, China's population more than doubled, from roughly 150 million to over 300 million, driven by extended peace, improved rice strains, and the introduction of New World crops like sweet potatoes and maize. With more mouths to feed, agricultural production expanded through new irrigation projects and terraced farming. Market towns flourished, merchant networks linked Jiangnan to Tibet, and regional specialties, silk, porcelain, tea, reached global markets. Yet beneath this prosperity lay growing strains. Rapid population growth exerted tremendous pressure on arable land. Families subdivided holdings, hillside terraces eroded, and forested areas were converted into fields. Soil fertility began to decline in well-trodden regions, and periodic famines, triggered by floods, droughts, or locust swarms, tested the imperial granary reserves. Although local officials were charged with maintaining food stocks, many turned a blind eye to hoarding or profiteering, undermining relief efforts when disaster struck. Corruption also seeped into the bureaucracy. Despite Yongzheng's secret memorial system and rigorous performance reviews, by the late 18th century, the central government faced challenges in policing distant provinces. Magistrates supplemented meager salaries with unofficial levies. Eunuchs and imperial princes formed cliques that vied for influence, and the practice of guanxi, personal networks, came to overshadow meritocratic appointments. A scandal in 1783 exposed embezzlement of salt taxes in Huai'an, leading to riots that the army had to quell. In Guangdong, merchants accused officials of extortion in the silk trade, prompting imperial edicts to curb abuses, but with limited enforcement. Meanwhile, Qianlong's own court displayed elements of overreach. The emperor's obsession with literary production led to the censorship and even burning of works deemed critical or heterodox, an aggressive campaign during the 1770s that targeted unorthodox sects and independent thinkers. While intended to ensure ideological unity, these actions alienated some scholars and stifled lively intellectual debate. At the same time, Maintaining the sprawling Qing Empire and its lavish court rituals drained the treasury. Expenditures on grand summer palaces, such as Chengde Mountain Resort, designed in multiple regional architectural styles, and costly frontier campaigns required ever larger tax revenues. As rural households labored under mounting corvée obligations and heavy land taxes, discontent simmered among the peasantry and gentry alike. By the close of Qianlong's reign in 1796, the empire stood at its zenith in territory and cultural achievement, yet it also bore the first clear signs of systemic stress. Population pressures, environmental degradation, and bureaucratic malfeasance hinted at a coming era of challenge. The golden age of art, literature, and encyclopedic mastery illuminated the brilliance of High Qing, but shadows lengthened as the empire's resources and administrative capacity strained under the weight of unprecedented demands, setting the stage for the tumultuous 19th century that lay just beyond the horizon. Empire at zenith, expansion and diversity. By the mid-18th century, the Qing Empire reached its greatest geographical extent in history. From the birch forests of Manchuria in the northeast, across the fertile North China Plain and the southern rice terraces, to the high plateaus of Tibet, the deserts of Xinjiang, and the tropical isles of Taiwan, Qing sovereignty spanned more than 10 million square kilometers. Under a single imperial throne, some 30 distinct peoples, Han Chinese, Manchus, Mongols, Tibetans, Uyghurs, and dozens of smaller ethnic groups, found themselves woven into one imperial tapestry. In Manchuria, the homeland of the Isin-Gyoro clan, banner garrisons and banner civilians formed the core of imperial identity. Here, Manchu language and customs persisted, even as intermarriage with Han elites increased. To the west, Mongol banners, Khalkha, Chaha, and Oirat maintained their traditional cavalry forces but served under Qing command. Their chieftains granted princely titles in exchange for military service. This alliance secured China's northern frontiers and guarded pastoral lands from steppe incursions. Xinjiang, newly conquered in the 1750s, presented fresh challenges of governance. Its Turco-Mongol Muslim populations, Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, held distinct legal and religious traditions. The Qing responded by establishing a new province, appointing both Manchu officials and local Muslim leaders, beg and aksakol, to administer civil law. Imperial decrees recognized Islamic courts for personal status and inheritance cases, while Qing military governors oversaw taxation, the salt monopoly, and policing. Caravan routes through the Tarim Basin linked Kashgar to Lanzhou, ensuring tribute flows of jade, horses, and carpets into the imperial granaries. In Tibet, the Qing adopted a priest-patron relationship. After expelling Dzungar occupiers in 1720, the Kangxi and Qianlong emperors installed the 7th Dalai Lama under imperial protection. Lamas and Sangpa nobility retained control over monasteries and local governance, while Qing ambans supervised foreign affairs and garrisoned Qing troops in Lhasa. This arrangement acknowledged Tibetan religious authority while embedding Tibet within a wider Qing tributary system that extended from Burma to Nepal. Further south, Taiwan, annexed in 1683, became Fujian Taiwan Province. Initially governed by military governors to suppress Ming loyalists, it gradually opened to Han migration. Settlers from southern Fujian and Guangdong introduced upland rice varieties, tea cultivation, and new fishing techniques. By the early 19th century, Taiwan's mixed population of Han settlers, indigenous Austronesian tribes, and Hakka newcomers formed a sparsely governed frontier, its remoteness an enduring challenge to central authority. Across all these regions, the Qing bureaucracy proved remarkably adaptable. At its summit sat the emperor, supported by the Grand Secretariat and the 6 boards. Under them, provincial governors, zunfu, and governor-generals Zongdu, administered civil and military affairs. Each province featured a layered hierarchy: prefects, county magistrates, and local functionaries who managed tax collection, legal disputes, and public works. For non-Han regions, the Qing often employed a model of indirect rule, co-opting local aristocracies into imperial ranks, while imposing standard legal codes for major crimes. Confucian ideology underpinned this vast imperial machinery. All office holders, whether Manchu, Mongol, or Han, sat for the civil examinations on Confucian classics. This common intellectual framework, filtered through imperial commentary, bound officials across ethnic lines to ideals of filial piety, loyalty to the throne, and moral governance. Mandarins supervised ritual sacrifices at local temples and the provincial porches of Confucian academies, ensuring that local elites paid homage to the emperor's place at the apex of the cosmic order. Yet diversity persisted in daily life. Muslim merchants in Kashgar wore the fez and recited Quranic prayers, while Tibetan monks chanted mantras in Lhasa's Jokang temple. Manchu bannermen in Beijing practiced mounted archery and wore the queue and robes of their ancestors, even as Han commoners filled city lanes in their long gowns. Local markets featured Uyghur carpets, Tibetan yak butter tea, Mongolian dairy products, and Han silks, all exchanged under the imperial mantle. Cultural fusion found its expression in the arts. Beijing's Court Painting Academy commissioned renditions of Tibetan thangkas alongside Chinese scrolls. Edicts were issued in Manchu and Chinese script. In Xinjiang, notices appeared in Uyghur Arabic script as well. Missionaries and merchants introduced Western clocks, telescopes, and medical texts, often filtered through Jesuit intermediaries, while Qing artisans adapted European motifs into cloisonné enamel and ivory carvings. This era of expansion and diversity represented the Qing Dynasty at its most confident and capacious. By incorporating myriad peoples under a unified meritocratic bureaucracy and by respecting local customs even as it imposed central standards, the Qing knit together an empire whose edges stretched from Siberia's snows to the South China Sea's warm currents. The empire at Zenith was a multi-ethnic realm at peace, its unity resting on a delicate balance of shared ideology, pragmatic governance, and an overarching vision of the emperor as the pivot of heaven and earth. Yet, as the 19th century approached, this very complexity would challenge Qing rulers faced with new external pressures and rising internal strains, revealing that governing diversity on such a grand scale carried both strength and fragility. Throughout the High Qing, emperors and their ministers sought to bind a sprawling multi-ethnic empire together through a shared moral framework, Confucian ideals. Yet they also preserved the distinct Manchu identity that had carried the dynasty to power. At court, the Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong emperors sponsored Confucian rituals, sacrifices to Confucius at the Temple of Literature, annual readings of the 5 classics, and civil examination reforms, making Confucian scholarship the lingua franca of governance. Scholar officials, drawn from Han, Mongol, and even some Manchu families, stood for impersonal merit over birthright so long as they mastered the classics. Simultaneously, Manchu bannermen retained privileged positions. They wore their traditional queues and riding boots, practiced archery and equestrian martial drills in the capital's riding grounds, and lived in distinct banner garrisons. The emperor himself would present archery prizes and riding honors at the annual Autumn Horse Festival, underscoring the martial roots of his lineage. Manchu language survived in court protocols and on official seals, while dual-language edicts in Manchu and Chinese reminded all subjects of the dynasty's dual heritage. On the economic front, the Qing maintained a tribute system that reinforced both their claim to universal lordship and control over lucrative trade routes. Envoys from Korea, Vietnam, Burma, and the various Central Asian Khanates continued the time-honored ritual of offering tribute, silk, silver, horses, and exotic woods, in exchange for bestowal of seals, imperial gifts, and trading rights. Along the Silk Road arteries stretching from Lanzhou through Gansu's Hexi corridor into Xinjiang, officials manned caravanserai and established customs stations. They regulated the flow of jade, horses, pepper, and Central Asian carpets, while ensuring that taxes and transit fees enriched provincial treasuries. Imperial warehouses stored tribute goods before they were reallocated to frontier garrisons or presented at court, a visible symbol of Qing supremacy over distant rulers. This tribute trade nexus dovetailed with broader commercial expansion. The Canton system concentrated foreign trade to Guangzhou, but internal goods moved north along the Grand Canal and south through Fujian ports. Merchants capitalized on safe highways and riverways under Qing patrols, shipping grain from the Yangtze Valley to feed Beijing's court, and provisioning Qing armies on campaign. The state-regulated salt monopoly and tea tax funded much of the imperial bureaucracy, further linking agricultural surplus to central authority. Underlying all of this was a stable agrarian society that fueled unprecedented population growth. New World crops, sweet potatoes, maize, and peanuts, complemented traditional rice and wheat, allowing cultivation in uplands and marginal soils. Village elders organized irrigation guilds to maintain canals and terraced fields, while magistrates supervised flood control projects. As epidemics waned and warfare receded under Qing peace, household registers recorded a doubling of the population between 1700 and 1800, reaching over 300 million. This demographic boom reinforced the empire's capacity for manpower. Large surpluses supported garrison troops in Tibet and Xinjiang, funded granaries in famine years, and furnished recruits for banner armies. It also supplied labor for burgeoning handicraft industries, porcelain kilns in Qing, silk workshops in Suzhou, whose wares filled both domestic markets and tribute gifts. Yet rapid population growth also sowed early seeds of strain. Land holdings fragmented as families subdivided plots, leading to smaller farms, often reliant on marginal hillsides. Magistrates struggled to register all households for taxation, and rural poverty persisted despite overall prosperity. Nonetheless, for much of the 18th century, the Qing Dynasty harnessed Confucian governance, Manchu military tradition, tribute networks, and agricultural abundance to sustain an empire at its territorial zenith. In this harmonious blend of cultures, China reached unparalleled prosperity, its imperial court commanding respect from Lhasa to Samarkand, and from the North China Plain to the shores of Formosa. Trade, silver, and Western encounters. By the early 18th century, the Qing Empire's frontiers were largely secure, and its agrarian economy humming with surplus. As peace prevailed across the mainland, a new challenge emerged on China's southern coast, managing contact with increasingly bold Western traders. To regulate this foreign presence, the Qing established the Canton system in 1757, confining all official Western trade to the bustling port of Guangzhou. There, a licensed merchant guild, the Kohong, held a monopoly on exchanges with foreign barbarians, primarily the British, French, Dutch, and Portuguese. Outside merchants were forbidden from venturing inland. They lived in designated factories along the Pearl River, their movements strictly controlled by Qing officials. This framework aimed to harness the benefits of foreign goods and silver while safeguarding Chinese society from unwanted influences and potential threats. Under the Canton system's rigid rules, China exported three main commodities that Western powers craved: tea, porcelain, and silk. Tea alone became the lifeblood of trade. Mornings in Britain and America would soon be unimaginable without its bitter warmth. As global consumption exploded, Tea exports soared from tens of thousands of pounds in the early 1700s to millions by century's end. Delicate porcelain wares, famously translucent and decorated in blue and white or famille rose palettes, adorned European dinner tables and cabinet rooms, symbolizing refinement and exotic luxury. Silk, woven in Suzhou's looms and printed in Hangzhou's workshops, draped aristocratic shoulders across Europe in patterns that evoked dragons, lotus blossoms, and intricate latticework. This export boom brought massive inflows of silver into China. Unlike most economies of the era, Qing China operated on a silver standard. Taxes were levied in silver taels, and merchants calculated profits in silver coin. As Western traders, especially the British East India Company, exchanged Spanish and Mexican silver for Chinese goods, silver flooded the southern ports and spread inland. Over decades, China absorbed the majority of the world's silver supply, anchoring its currency and fueling domestic economic growth. Village markets used silver syces for transactions, while merchants hoarded silver bars for security against harvest failures or military levies. Even small roadside tea shops displayed silver scales, weighing out the daily ration in sparkling ingots. Yet this silver flow created imbalances. Western demand for Chinese goods far outstripped Chinese appetite for Western manufactures, from woolens to glassware. As silver left Europe, Europe felt the pinch. In China, silver stocks swelled, encouraging merchants to export bullion back to Europe for re-exportation to other markets. Concerned by this drain on European wealth, the British East India Company sought to correct the imbalance by increasing exports of Indian opium to China, an illicit trade that would later spark devastating conflicts. Long before opium clouds darkened the horizon, the British pressed the Qing for expanded trade rights. Early in the 18th century, company captains dispatched petitions demanding direct access to inland markets and diplomatic recognition. They saw the Kohong restrictions as artificial barriers, hindrances to profit rather than prudent precautions. Qing officials, wary of fracturing the tribute system and exposing the hinterlands to foreign religions and ideas, firmly rebuffed these overtures, insisting that all foreign affairs be routed through the Board of Rights in Beijing. Tensions simmered as each side's worldview clashed. The British believed in free trade and diplomatic equality under international norms, while the Qing Dynasty held to a Sino-centric order that ranked all foreign states as tributaries to the Middle Kingdom. In 1793, Lord Macartney's embassy, bearing lavish gifts, arrived in Beijing to petition Emperor Qianlong. The emperor's famous response, that Chinese civilization needed nothing from the barbarians, reflected the deep cultural gulf separating the two powers. Although courtiers treated the British guests with generous banquets, audiences, and polite ritual, no substantive trade concessions followed. Back in Canton, trade continued under increasingly strained circumstances. The Kohong merchants, facing mounting Western demands and fluctuating silver prices, raised prices on tea and silk. Western ships grew impatient at annual trading seasons and shipping delays. Smuggling became common. Small junks slipped opium into the Pearl River estuary, and hidden warehouses stored contraband silver and textiles. By the 1830s, these illegal channels had grown into a torrent, setting the stage for the opium wars that would upend the very world the Canton system had sought to protect. Thus, the mid-Qing period witnessed a paradox. China, flush with silver and commanding a global monopoly on tea, porcelain, and silk, found itself hemmed in by an inflexible trade framework that both enriched its economy and sowed the seeds of future crisis. The Canton system's tight rein over foreign merchants maintained order for decades, but the pressures of demand, silver imbalances, and Western insistence on equal treatment would soon test the Qing Empire's capacity to adapt, ushering in an era of conflict that would reshape China's place in the world. Despite the riches pouring into China's coffers, Qing rulers remained wary of Western demands for diplomatic parity. As the British East India Company sought to dispatch ambassadors to Beijing and negotiate treaties on equal footing, Qing officials responded with a firm insistence on traditional protocols. Foreign envoys, regarded as tribute mission representatives rather than legitimate diplomats, were required to perform the kowtow, a series of ritual prostrations, before the emperor's tablet. This act symbolized the acknowledgement of Chinese supremacy, a notion the British found intolerable. When Lord Macartney arrived in 1793 bearing gifts of scientific instruments and luxury goods, the Qianlong emperor refused to grant most of the concessions he sought. Though the Britons were treated with courtesy, their requests for fixed tariffs, direct access to North China markets, and residence in the capital were rebuffed. In official edicts, the Qing court emphasized that China, as the Middle Kingdom, needed nothing from outsiders. Imperial proclamations warned against unchecked Western influence, pointing to Christian missionaries as a threat to social harmony and to uncontrolled trade as a source of moral decay. Canton's Governor-General enforced strict regulations. Foreign ships were confined to Hong Kong Bay during off-season months. Private correspondence with the mainland was monitored, and the Kohong merchants, rather than foreign traders, remained the sole intermediaries for all commerce. Any breach, unauthorized travel, illicit goods, unauthorized meetings with Chinese officials, was met with confiscation, fines, or even imprisonment. This policy of resistance, rooted in centuries of tribute-based diplomacy, inadvertently sowed the seeds of conflict as Western powers grew more insistent. The British, fueled by a mercantilist drive to correct the silver outflow and open new markets, saw the Canton system as a straitjacket preventing free trade. Their opium imports, banned by the Qing due to the drug's social harm, flowed ever more freely through smuggling networks, emboldened by corrupt local officials, tempted by silver bribes. When Qing Commissioner Lin Zexu moved in 1839 to confiscate and destroy over 1,000 tons of opium at Human, he struck a blow at British mercantile interests and provoked a military response. The First Opium War erupted not from purely ideological clash, but from this collision of trade practices and diplomatic posturing. British warships, under orders to protect free commerce, bombarded coastal forts and blockaded ports, demonstrating the superiority of steam-powered vessels and rifled cannons. The Qing, steeped in the belief that heaven's mandate ensured ultimate victory, were unprepared for industrial-era firepower. Their defenses, manned by banner troops trained in archery and musket drill, crumpled under sustained naval bombardment. The subsequent Treaty of Nanjing, 1842, forced the Qing to concede Hong Kong Island, open 5 treaty ports to British residents and trade, and pay massive indemnities. The very tributes once carefully managed through Canton were now subject to foreign whims and gunboat coercion. Other Western nations, France, the United States, Russia, saw Qing weakness and demanded similar privileges, carving out extraterritorial rights and fixed low tariffs that eroded sovereign control over trade and legal jurisdiction. Thus, the Qing court's initial resistance to foreign diplomatic overtures, rooted in a worldview of Chinese centrality and self-sufficiency, collided with Western demands forged in mercantile capitalism. What began as a system of regulated tribute trade at Guangzhou became, through mutual misunderstanding and escalating coercion, a catalyst for military conflict that exposed the empire's vulnerabilities and set the stage for an era of unequal treaties. In seeking to preserve traditional order, the Qing inadvertently fueled the very crises that would undermine their authority and reshape China's relationship with the wider world. Opium Wars and Unequal Treaties. By the early 19th century, The silver that once flooded Qing China began to ebb. Britain's voracious appetite for Chinese tea had created a massive trade imbalance. Vast quantities of silver flowed out of Britain and into China, threatening British merchants and the Bank of England. To redress this deficit, the British East India Company turned to opium grown in Bengal. Though officially banned by both British and Qing authorities, opium trade, carried by private British merchants and Indian middlemen, grew exponentially. Small fast dhows and piragua boats plied the South China Sea, evading Qing patrols to deliver Indian opium to Canton's warehouses. By the 1830s, an estimated 1,400 chests of opium, each weighing 77 kilograms, made their way into China annually. Widespread addiction followed, with social and economic consequences rippling through urban and rural communities alike. Farmers sold spring rice to buy winter opium. Artisans pawned tools and silks to feed cravings. Entire families fell into debt. Qing officials, alarmed by the silver outflow and the damage to public morals, demanded the cessation of the trade. In 1838, Commissioner Lin Zexu was appointed by the Daoguang Emperor to eradicate opium from the empire. Lin arrived in Canton with strict orders: confiscate and destroy all opium stocks, punish corrupt officials aiding smugglers, and forbid further trade. He famously placed an advertisement warning addicts to quit or face punishment, and sealed off foreign factories to prevent more shipments. Tensions escalated when British merchants sought compensation for seized opium, but Lin refused, insisting that Chinese law superseded foreign claims. In March 1839, Qing authorities destroyed over 20,000 chests, more than 1,500 tons, of opium on the beaches of Human, mixing the drug into pits of salt water and lime in a spectacle watched by anxious Western onlookers. Provoked by this wholesale destruction of property, the British government dispatched naval squadrons under the command of Commodore George Elliot, utilizing steam-powered ships and Congreve rockets, technologies unknown to Qing defenders. The British engaged in a series of coastal bombardments. From the mouth of the Pearl River to the forts of Chusan and the fleet anchored off Ningbo, Qing soldiers lacked the firepower and training to resist. The Daoguang Emperor's court, bound by traditional military doctrine and hampered by logistical delays, scrambled to assemble forces, but found their antiquated matchlock guns and junks no match for steam frigates and rifled cannons. Major engagements, the capture of Chusan Island, the Battle of the Bogue Forts, and the advance up the Yangtze River to Nanjing, showcased Qing vulnerability. Morale collapsed as generals retreated from each encounter, leaving local gentry and villagers to face the British alone. By August 1842, exhausted and confronted by threatened occupation of the capital, the Daoguang Emperor authorized negotiations. The resulting Treaty of Nanjing imposed unprecedented, unequal terms on the Qing. Hong Kong Island ceded in perpetuity, 5 treaty ports open to foreign residents and trade: Canton, Amoy, Foochow, Ningpo, and Shanghai, a fixed low tariff of 5%, and an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars. Crucially, British citizens received extraterritorial rights, placing them beyond Qing legal jurisdiction. These concessions shattered the old tributary framework, signaling a new era in which Western powers dictated terms to the Middle Kingdom. Thus, the rise of the British opium trade, spawned by a silver imbalance, and the Qing response under the Daoguang Emperor ignited the First Opium War. This conflict exposed the military and diplomatic frailty of a once dominant empire and ushered in decades of foreign interference through unequal treaties that would erode Qing sovereignty and reshape China's place in the modern world. The Treaty of Nanjing, signed on August 29, 1842, marked the end of the First Opium War and the beginning of a new, humiliating chapter in Qing history. Under its terms, China ceded Hong Kong Island in perpetuity to Britain, transforming a once forbidden port into a British Crown colony and a springboard for Western commerce in East Asia. 5 strategic treaty ports, Canton, Guangzhou, Amoy, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Fuzhou, Ningpo, Ningbo, and Shanghai, were opened to foreign residents and trade, dismantling the Canton system's long-standing monopoly. British merchants, once confined to factory compounds, could establish firms, warehouses, and missionary stations, while Chinese authorities lost the power to tax or regulate their activities beyond a fixed 5% tariff. An indemnity of 21 million silver dollars was imposed on the Qing state to cover British war expenses and opium losses, placing a heavy burden on the treasury already strained by internal rebellions and natural calamities. These payments, combined with the cost of rebuilding coastal defenses and the diversion of resources to enforce unequal treaty terms, undermined the dynasty's fiscal stability. Moreover, the Treaty of Nanjing granted British subjects extraterritoriality, meaning they were tried by their own consular courts rather than Qing magistrates, eroding the empire's legal sovereignty within its own borders. Barely a decade later, tensions reignited, leading to the Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860. Western powers, Britain and France in the vanguard, objected to Qing violations of the Treaty of Nanjing and sought expanded privileges, diplomatic representation in Beijing, legalization of the opium trade, and free movement of missionaries. A minor incident in 1856, known as the Arrow Incident, when Qing officials boarded the British-registered vessel Arrow in Canton, provided the pretext for renewed hostilities. British forces, joined by a French expedition citing the execution of a French missionary, bombarded coastal fortresses, looted arsenals, and advanced up the Pearl River. In 1858, the Treaty of Tianjin ratified new concessions. China agreed to legalize opium, open up 11 additional treaty ports, including Canton's European suburbs, permit foreign travel to the capital and inland waterways, and remit further indemnities. However, the Qing court dragged its feet on ratification, and by 1859, Western envoys in Beijing found themselves under siege by Qing forces at the Taku forts. In retaliation, Anglo-French troops launched a swift, ruthless campaign in 1860. They stormed the Taku forts, occupied Tianjin, and marched on Beijing. The advance culminated in the looting and burning of the old Summer Palace, Ming, and the Summer Palace at Chengde, acts of retribution ordered after the capture and suspected mistreatment of Western envoys. These images of widely circulated atrocities cemented the perception of Qing weakness and Western aggression. The Convention of Beijing followed in October 1860, ratifying earlier treaties and adding onerous clauses. Cession of the Kowloon Peninsula adjacent to Hong Kong, rights for Russia to occupy the Ili region, later returned, and expanded missionary freedoms. Together, these successive treaties shattered the Qing's control over its own territory and legal system. The once coveted tribute relationships gave way to gunboat diplomacy. Western powers arbitrarily extended spheres of influence, carving out concessions in port cities where they administered extraterritorial courts, collected customs duties, and constructed infrastructure to their specifications. Other nations, Russia, the United States, Germany, and Japan, demanded similar privileges, eroding Qing sovereignty piece by piece. By 1860, the Qing dynasty had transitioned from a confident continental empire to a patchwork of imperial domains under foreign scrutiny. Its authority over coastal and riverine trade was supplanted by Western companies backed by naval power. Financially, indemnities and reparations drained the treasury, forcing the government to seek loans from foreign banks. Politically, The dynasty's inability to prevent the violation of its capital and the desecration of its gardens undermined the mandate of heaven in the eyes of many subjects. The era of unequal treaties thus stands as the watershed moment in Qing history, a period when Western industrial and military might overpowered traditional Chinese defenses and diplomatic norms, signaling the beginning of the empire's gradual loss of sovereignty. In the decades that followed, these concessions would compound, setting the stage for internal rebellions, reform movements, and the eventual collapse of imperial rule in the 20th century. Internal strife, Taiping, and other rebellions. In the mid-19th century, as the Qing dynasty reeled from foreign humiliation, an even more cataclysmic upheaval erupted from within. From 1850 to 1864, China was convulsed by the Taiping Rebellion, the largest civil war in human history, by casualty count and destruction. At its heart stood a visionary leader named Hong Xiuquan, whose personal crisis transformed into a millenarian movement that would threaten the very foundations of Qing rule. Hong was born in Guangdong province in 1814, the son of a Hakka peasant family. Twice he failed the provincial examinations, an outcome that left him disillusioned and physically ill. In his despair, Hong experienced a series of dreams and revelations, visions in which he believed himself the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to establish a heavenly kingdom on earth. Drawing on Christian tracts circulated by American missionaries, he reinterpreted the Old and New Testaments through a uniquely Chinese lens, casting the Qing Manchus as the demonic Tatars who oppressed true believers. By 1851, Hong had attracted thousands of followers, peasants, disaffected scholars, and marginalized Hakka communities, who rallied under the banner of the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace, Taiping Tianguo. In January of that year, they declared their capital at Jintian, proclaimed the abolition of private land ownership, and instituted communal sharing of crops and goods. Their radical social program forbade opium, alcohol, and foot binding, while promoting gender equality. Women served as soldiers and officials, and a new calendar replaced traditional festivals with days commemorating Taiping victories. Within 3 years, Taiping armies marched northward, capturing Nanjing in 1853 and renaming it Tianjing, heavenly capital. From this stronghold, Hong and his generals administered territory home to some 30 million people. Factories and granaries were nationalized, Christian-inspired schools taught the new doctrine, and a lavish court of princes and princesses styled itself on both Chinese imperial and Christian models. Meanwhile, the Qing court in Beijing grappled with foreign pressures and internal dissent, unable at first to muster a coherent military response. The rebellion's scale was staggering. Estimates suggest at least 20 million lives were lost across a dozen provinces, though some scholars place the figure even higher. Cities were besieged, farmland laid waste, and refugee streams drenched the countryside. Flood control dikes were deliberately broken to halt rebel advances, triggering famines that deepened suffering among civilians. Local gentry organized volunteer armies, and Qing officials enlisted regional strongmen, Zheng Guofan, Li Hongzhang, and Zhuo Zongtang, whose Yong'an armies slowly chipped away at Taiping territory through grueling sieges and guerrilla tactics. By 1864, after 11 years of brutal warfare, Nanjing fell. Hong Xiuquan himself had withdrawn into seclusion and died in 1864. Accounts vary whether by poisoning or illness. His lieutenants were executed or captured, and Qing banners reclaimed each city. Yet the empire emerged profoundly weakened. The immense human cost eroded tax revenues. Provincial armies, once tools of central power, retained autonomy and influence, foreshadowing the rise of warlordism in the 20th century. Simultaneously, other uprisings fractured the Qing realm. In the 1850s and 1860s, The Nian Rebellion in northern Anhui and Henan provinces saw former Taiping defectors joining bands of bandits whose seasonal raids threatened the Grand Canal and imperial granaries. In the far southwest, Muslim uprisings, led by Ma Hualong in the northwest and Du Wenxiu in Yunnan, challenged Qing rule on religious and ethnic grounds. The Miao Rebellion in Guizhou saw mountain communities rise against Han exploitation, while the Red Turban sects and small millenarian cults flared across Guangdong. The Qing court, already stretched thin by external concessions and indemnities, relied heavily on provincial armies rather than the traditional banner forces. Zheng Guofan's Xiang army, drawn from Hunan peasants, and Li Hongzhang's Huai army, recruited in Anhui, were better trained and motivated than banner troops, but answerable primarily to their own commanders. This shift marked the devolution of military power away from Beijing, eroding central authority and planting the seeds of fragmentation in the late Qing period. Despite the scale of devastation, the Qing managed to survive. They adopted self-strengthening reforms, modernizing arsenals and railroads, and sought foreign expertise to rebuild arsenals. Yet the era of internal strife irrevocably altered the dynasty's trajectory. A weakened state, burdened by debt, standing armies loyal to provincial strongmen, and a population traumatized by decades of war. In the twilight hours before sleep, imagine the battered walls of Nanjing's old gates, the smoke still rising from burnt rice paddies, and the weary survivors trudging home under a shaken sky. The Taiping Rebellion, born of millenarian hope, exacted a bitter price, millions of lives lost, and a Qing state forever changed. As dawn breaks on the next chapter, self-strengthening and foreign threats, we carry forward the memory of those who sought to remake China in the name of heavenly peace, only to witness the learning curve of an empire plunged into its most destructive crucible. Even as the Qing court poured resources into crushing the Taiping heavenly kingdom, a cascade of other uprisings broke out across the empire, compounding the crisis and revealing the dynasty's growing reliance on regional armies rather than the traditional banner forces. In northern Anhui and Henan provinces, the Nian bands, formerly coastal salt smugglers displaced by the Taiping, organized into loose coalitions of guerrilla fighters. Exploiting the flat, marshy terrain along the Yellow River, they raided supply convoys and government granaries using small, fast boats and hit-and-run tactics that confounded imperial generals. With neither centralized command nor clear ideology beyond plunder and local defense, the Nian rebels nonetheless tied down tens of thousands of Qing troops for years. Simultaneously, the far northwest erupted in Muslim rebellions. In Gansu and Qinghai, Hui Muslim communities led by Ma Hualong and his successors declared an Islamic kingdom of great peace, invoking jihad against what they saw as Manchu usurpers. These fighters, hardened by mountain warfare and inspired by local Sufi orders, seized key towns like Jinjipu and Didao. They administered their territories with parallel Islamic courts, collecting zakat-style tithes and enforcing Sharia, while dispatching raiding parties across the Hexi corridor to capture Qing grain stores. The Qing response, sending banner columns into forbidding deserts and high plateaus, proved costly and slow, revealing the limitations of the banner armies when faced with decentralized insurgencies. In the southwestern province of Guizhou, the Miao people, indigenous highland tribes famed for their embroidery and hill-fort villages, rose in rebellion as well. Years of ethnic discrimination, forced labor, and the spread of Han agricultural migrants had provoked deep resentment. Beginning in 1854, Miao insurgents launched coordinated attacks on Han settlements, cutting down crops and ambushing magistrates. Qing forces, unfamiliar with the rugged terrain and reliant on foot soldiers in red uniforms, suffered embarrassing defeats. Only when regional commanders recruited local militias, often led by Han merchants and displaced gentry, did they manage to retake key passes and suppress major strongholds by 1873. These multiple fronts exposed a crucial shift in Qing military organization. Under Kangxi and Qianlong, banner troops, descendants of Nurhaci's original regiments, had formed the backbone of imperial security. But by the mid-19th century, banner strength had decayed. Units were underfed, corruptly administered, and burdened by hereditary stipends that discouraged active service. In contrast, regional Yong'an armies, like Zheng Guofan's Hunan-Xiang Army, Li Hongzhang's Anhui Huai Army, and Zhuo Zongtang's Zhejiang forces, provided the disciplined, motivated troops necessary to confront rebellions. These armies recruited locally, paid regular salaries from provincial revenues, and embraced modern weapons supplied by Western advisors. Their successes in suppressing Taiping, Nian, and Muslim uprisings earned them prestige and autonomy. Yet this reliance on provincial armies carried profound political consequences. Commanders like Zheng and Li answered first to their own patronage networks and to the wealthiest gentry who funded their forces, rather than to distant court eunuchs or distant banner generals. They maintained separate arsenals, workshops, and supply lines. When their campaigns ended, these armies were only partially disbanded. Many officers and soldiers remained armed and organized within their home provinces. Provincial treasuries, swollen by indemnities extracted from defeated rebels, financed further military and commercial ventures, reinforcing regional power bases. The Qing court tolerated this devolution of authority because it had little alternative. Without the Xiang, Huai, and other regional armies, the dynasty might have collapsed under the weight of simultaneous revolts. But the bargain eroded central control. Imperial edicts struggled to command obedience when regional armies held the real enforcement power. Governors-general, originally intended as rotating provincial overseers, increasingly acted as warlords commanding personal armies. By the 1870s, China's military landscape resembled a mosaic of semi-autonomous fiefdoms held together by the symbolic authority of the emperor in Beijing. As the sun sets on this chapter of strife, imagine the vast reaches of southern Anhui, where Nian riders slip along riverbanks, the freezing winds of Gansu, where Hui rebels fortify mountain passes, the misty heights of Guizhou, where Miao warriors vanish into forested hills. The Qing dynasty's survival of these uprisings came at a steep price: the fragmentation of military power and the rise of regional strongmen who would play pivotal roles in the empire's final decades. In the flicker of campfires on distant frontiers, we see both the resilience of local communities defending their way of life and the cracks appearing in the edifice of imperial unity, a prelude to the broader transformations that would engulf China in the 20th century. Self-strengthening and foreign threats. In the wake of the Opium Wars and the Taiping convulsions, Qing court officials faced a stark realization. China's traditional institutions and weaponry were no match for Western industrial might. From the 1860s onward, a movement known as the self-strengthening began to take shape, championed by reform-minded governors like Zheng Guofan, Li Hongzhang, and Zhuo Zongtang. They believed that learning from the barbarians in military technology and industry could shore up imperial power without abandoning Confucian fundamentals. At the heart of these efforts lay new arsenals and shipyards erected along the southern and northern coasts. The Jiangnan Arsenal in Shanghai built modern rifled cannons and breech-loading rifles, while the Fuzhou dockyard constructed first steam-powered gunboats under British supervision. Inland, the Hanyang Arsenal in Hubei province began producing Mauser rifles under German license. These factories trained Chinese technicians in casting steel, machining barrels, and laying ironclad hull plates, skills previously unheard of in the Qing world. Parallel to military modernization, industrial ventures emerged. Telegraph lines linked Beijing to Tianjin and the treaty ports. Cotton mills in Shanghai and Wuxi spun thread for both domestic use and export. Coal mines and rail depots sprouted near strategic centers, like Taiping. To manage these enterprises, the court founded the Tongwen Guan School of Combined Learning in Beijing, where students studied English, French, and technical sciences, alongside the 4 books and 5 classics. Graduates went on to staff foreign legations and train as naval engineers, bridging Confucian scholarship with Western expertise. Yet these initiatives ignited fierce debate at court. The conservative faction, led by staunch ritualists and palace eunuchs, argued that any adoption of foreign methods threatened the moral fabric of the empire. They feared that Western education would undermine Confucian values and that factories would divert labor from traditional agriculture. To them, foreign technology was a tool, not a model for broader institutional reform. Opposing them stood the reformists, who saw industrial and military modernization as indispensable. They pushed for further measures, sending Chinese students abroad to study science and engineering, translating Western textbooks, and even exploring the concept of constitutional government. Figures like Prince Gong, head of the Zhongli Yamen, the Qing Foreign Affairs Office, and Li Hongzhang, Governor-General of Jili, argued that only a partially westernized army and navy could protect China's sovereignty. This tug-of-war over China's soul reached its peak during the Tongji Restoration, 1862 to 1874, a period of talented regents trying to revive Qing prestige. But internal factions and court intrigues slowed progress, leaving modernization piecemeal and regionally uneven. Amid these currents, a formidable figure emerged: Empress Dowager Cixi. As regent for her young son, the Tongji Emperor, Cixi wielded the reins of power behind the throne. A shrewd politician, she navigated between conservatives and reformers, adopting practical elements of the self-strengthening movement while safeguarding her own authority. She supported Li Hongzhang's arsenal projects, but vetoed constitutional experiments that might empower rivals. She hosted foreign envoys at the Summer Palace with lavish hospitality to signal Qing openness, yet maintained strict control over all court appointments. When the Tongji Emperor died in 1875 without an heir, Cixi placed her 3-year-old nephew on the throne as the Guangxu Emperor, continuing her regency. Under her aegis, small-scale reforms continued: the establishment of the Imperial University in Beijing, the first maritime customs service staffed by Chinese and foreign experts, and the founding of modern postal and telegraph networks. Yet Cixi's overriding priority remained dynastic stability. She resisted deeper political reforms, such as elected assemblies or a constitutional charter, fearing they would undermine imperial power. Cixi's balancing act shaped the late Qing. Military arsenals expanded but lacked unified command. Industrial factories grew but remained dependent on foreign machinery and expertise. Educational institutions taught both Chinese classics and Western science, but produced graduates unable to overhaul the exam system. The Qing Empire thus entered the 1880s, a patchwork of modern outposts amidst an overwhelmingly traditional polity. Meanwhile, foreign threats renewed urgency. Russia eyed Manchuria's rail routes, France seized Vietnam. Japan, after its own modernization, looked across the Yellow Sea with imperial designs. Each crisis tested the limits of the self-strengthening. Qing armies equipped with modern rifles often faltered against foreign drill and leadership. Industrial factories could not rival the scale of Western firms. Canton's treaty ports remained under foreign legal jurisdiction. In the flickering lantern light of court debates and the clang of steam hammers in distant arsenals, the Qing faced its paradox. An empire determined to preserve ancient traditions was also compelled to import foreign techniques. Under Empress Dowager Cixi, China embarked on a narrow path of selective modernization, strengthening arms and industry while limiting political reform. This uneasy compromise sustained the dynasty for a few more decades, but left it unprepared for the sweeping transformations soon to come. The rise of nationalist movements, the scramble for spheres of influence, and the ultimate revolution that would end 2,100 years of imperial rule. As the Qing court pursued selective modernization, fresh crises tested the limits of its reforms. In northern Indochina, French interests clashed with Qing regional authority, igniting the Sino-French War of 1884 to 1885. France, expanding its colonial network in Southeast Asia, sought to consolidate control over Vietnam, long a Chinese tributary. Qing officials had supported the Vietnamese Black Flag militias and nominally retained suzerainty in Tonkin's borderlands, deploying a small expeditionary force to guard frontier posts. French gunboats steamed up the Red River, bombarding Chinese-held forts at Fuzhou and threatening coastal cities along Fujian and Guangdong. Despite modern rifles from the self-strengthening arsenals, Qing troops lacked unified command and naval support. Their Zhenyuan-class ironclads, launched only a few years earlier, were outnumbered and hindered by logistical delays. On land, provincial armies under generals like Liu Yongfu achieved local successes, storming Langson and inflicting casualties, but could not match French discipline and artillery coordination. In March 1885, French forces won the Battle of Tuyen-Quang, capturing a key outpost after a prolonged siege, while concurrent French assaults on Keelung in Taiwan exposed the island's coastal defenses. Facing international pressure and wary of overextending scarce resources, Empress Dowager Cixi negotiated an uneasy peace at the Treaty of Tientsin, June 9, 1885. The Qing acknowledged France's protectorate over Vietnam, losing influence in a region they had long regarded as within their sphere. In return, the French ceased attacks on Taiwan and withdrew from Chinese ports. But the message was stark. Modern European armies could dictate terms on China's southern flank. Less than a decade later, a far more devastating conflict erupted in Northeast Asia. The First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895, pitted Qing forces against a newly modernized Japan under the Meiji Restoration. Korea's strategic position, once a Chinese tributary kingdom, became the flashpoint. Both powers dispatched military missions and advisors to Seoul to protect their interests. Tensions boiled over when peasant uprisings in Korea's Tonghak movement challenged the Joseon court, prompting the Koreans to request Chinese troops in early 1894. Japan, invoking its own treaty rights, landed forces at Incheon, seizing control of the peninsula. The Qing response was hampered by bureaucratic inertia and regional rivalries. Orders to mobilize the Beiyang fleet, China's pride built in German and British shipyards, were delayed by court intrigues and fears that aggressive action would alienate Western powers. When Admiral Ding Ruchang finally mobilized, his flagship, the Dingyuan, and sister ships faced the Japanese combined fleet in the Yellow Sea. At the Battle of the Yalu River in September 1894, Japanese cruisers, benefiting from superior training and tactics, outmaneuvered the Beiyang squadron and sank or disabled half the flagship vessels. On land, Japanese infantry equipped with Krupp rifles and Krupp field guns advanced swiftly. They captured the Liaodong Peninsula, routed Qing armies at Pyongyang and Juliancheng, and pressed toward Mukden, Shenyang. Despite valiant resistance by regional armies, General Liu Kunyi's troops in Jili province, and generals like Songqing in Manchuria, the fragmented Qing command could not coordinate a unified defense. By April 1895, Japanese forces threatened the gates of Beijing itself. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, April 17, 1895, forced the Qing to cede Taiwan and the Pescadores Islands to Japan, recognize Korea as an independent state, ending China's centuries-old suzerainty, pay a massive indemnity of 200 million taels of silver, and open additional ports to Japanese trade and residents. The Japanese flag flew on Formosan soil. Its army occupied strategic passes in northeastern China, and Chinese prestige lay in tatters. These twin conflicts, framed by the self-strengthening era's partial reforms, revealed the dynasty's shortcomings. Provincial armies, though effective against internal rebellions, failed against professional European-style forces operating far from home. Modern ironclads and Krupp artillery outmatched Chinese arsenals, while the centralized court's indecision hindered rapid mobilization. Moreover, the loss of Vietnam, Taiwan, and Korea shattered long-held notions of China's regional primacy and tributary system. By the late 1890s, the Qing dynasty had confronted defeat on two fronts, in tropical Indochina and across the Yellow Sea. These losses accelerated calls for deeper political and educational reforms, emboldening a new generation of thinkers like Kang Yue and Liang Qichao, who would soon press for constitutional monarchy and modern institutions. Meanwhile, Empress Dowager Cixi, half-heartedly supporting self-strengthening projects, also diverted resources to shore up her own position, leaving systemic weaknesses unaddressed. In the dimming glow of the 19th century, China emerged precariously exposed to foreign power, its sovereignty curtailed, its peripheries carved into spheres of influence, and its confidence deeply shaken. The seeds of conflict sown in the opium trade and early unequal treaties had blossomed into outright wars that expunged centuries of Chinese diplomatic tradition. And as the Qing entered its final decades, the empire faced the most profound challenge of its storied history. Scramble for concessions, foreign encroachment. By the closing years of the 19th century, China's weakened sovereignty invited direct foreign penetration far beyond treaty ports. Western powers, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and Japan, carved out spheres of influence, regions where each enjoyed exclusive rights to railways, mining concessions, and commercial privileges. These enclaves were often formalized through a patchwork of leases, railway agreements, and joint stock companies, effectively dividing Chinese territory into semi-colonial zones. In the northeast, Russia secured its hold over Manchuria. Following the brief Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, but well before that conflict, Tsarist authorities had negotiated the Sino-Russian Secret Protocol of 1896, granting them railway rights in southern Manchuria. They built the Chinese Eastern Railway, linking Harbin to Port Arthur and Dalian, which they occupied under a 25-year lease. Russian engineers laid broad-gauge tracks, established military garrisons along the line, and founded towns like Harbin, which became a hub of Russian culture and Orthodox churches. The railway not only transported coal and grain to Russian markets, but also stood as a symbol of foreign sway over Chinese infrastructure. On the opposite shore, Germany extracted concessions on China's northern coast. In 1898, Emperor Wilhelm II demanded and obtained a 99-year lease of Jiaozhou Bay around Qingdao, Qingtao, from the Guangxu Emperor under duress. The Germans transformed the fishing village into a model colonial port, paved streets, German-style villas for administrators, and a brewery that produced Qingdao's famous beer. They extended narrow-gauge railways into the Shandong hinterland, exploiting iron mines at Jinan and tin deposits inland. Under German rule, Qingdao became an enclave where German language, law, and architecture held sway, another clear sign of China's eroded autonomy. Elsewhere, Britain fortified its supremacy in the Yangtze Valley, while France expanded from Indochina into Guangxi and Yunnan, securing mineral rights and road concessions. Belgium, in competition with France, obtained timber and mining leases in Sichuan. Even Japan, victorious in 1895, extended influence into Liaodong and built railways southward from Dalian. By the turn of the century, mapmakers could sketch China's coastline etched with foreign flags, each claiming exclusive spheres, each undermining central control. The cumulative effect of these concessions was national humiliation and growing popular resentment. Chinese officials at the Zhongli Yamen lamented the gradual loss of tariff autonomy and legal jurisdiction, but the court's feeble protests did little to alter the foreign grip. Reformers and revolutionaries alike decried the scramble for concessions as evidence that the Qing had failed to defend the nation, fueling calls for radical change. In this combustible atmosphere, the Boxer Rebellion erupted in 1899 in northern Shandong and Hebei provinces. The Boxers, or the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, were a secret society practicing martial exercises and invoking mystical invulnerability. Fueled by economic hardship, anti-foreign lanes, and rumors of Christian plots, they targeted foreign missionaries, Chinese Christians, and railway construction crews. Beginning with the burning of churches and railway stations, the uprising quickly spread to Beijing's suburbs, where the Boxers rallied imperial support. Empress Dowager Cixi, torn between approving the anti-foreign fervor and preserving diplomatic relations, eventually sided with the Boxers. In June 1900, royal edicts declared war on all foreign powers, and Boxer bands streamed into Beijing, besieging the foreign legation quarter. For 55 harrowing days, diplomats, missionaries, and civilians held out behind barricades against periodic assaults. Alarmed by the threat to their citizens, 8 nations, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, the United States, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, formed the 8-Nation Alliance. In August 1900, their combined expeditionary force of some 20,000 troops marched on Beijing, defeating mixed Qing and Boxer contingents at Tianjin and then breaching the capital's outer defenses. Coalition soldiers looted the Summer Palace once more and rescued the besieged legations amidst street-to-street fighting. The Boxer Protocol of September 1901 imposed draconian terms on China, an indemnity of 450 million taels of silver payable over 39 years, permanent stationing of foreign troops in Beijing and 4 northern ports, and permission for foreign envoys to travel anywhere in China. The protocol further forbade China from employing foreigners to train its army and required execution of officials who had supported the Boxers. China's sovereignty sank to new lows as annual payments consumed a quarter of the government's revenue and foreign garrisons patrolled its capital. Thus, the scramble for concessions and the Boxer Rebellion marked the apogee of foreign encroachment on Qing China. Once proud flags flying over unified frontiers, the imperial map now read as an international pie chart. Qing China emerged from these trials as a semi-colonial state, its territorial integrity compromised, its treasury drained, and its imperial authority irreparably weakened. An empire grappling with the humiliation of foreign occupation, even as the seeds of revolution were sown in the hearts of its people. The defeat of the Boxer Rebellion concluded with the signing of the Boxer Protocol on September 7, 1901, forcing the Qing Dynasty to swallow yet another bitter pill of foreign domination. Under the protocol's terms, China was compelled to pay an unprecedented indemnity of 450 million taels of silver, roughly equivalent to 4 times the government's annual revenue, over 39 years at 4% interest. These payments would siphon away precious funds needed for domestic recovery and reform, plunging provincial treasuries ever deeper into debt. Beyond financial penalties, The protocol granted the Eight-Nation Alliance permanent stationing rights for foreign troops in Beijing and at 4 northern treaty ports, Tianjin, Dalian, Yingkou, and Qingdao. Barracks were constructed on the outskirts of the capital, and foreign legation guards patrolled major thoroughfares, enforcing curfews and exerting quasi-administrative authority. This presence transformed Beijing into a quasi-occupied city, its imperial gates guarded not by Qing bannermen or Green Standard soldiers, but by European and Japanese riflemen on sentry duty. Foreign powers also secured the right to keep armed legation guards to protect their missions anywhere in China, effectively nullifying Qing control over security in its own territory. They demanded the dismantling of coastal defenses that might threaten their gunboats and the construction of military railways to facilitate troop movement. In effect, the Qing's once vaunted sovereignty was dissected into carved-out enclaves overseen by foreign armies. The protocol further stipulated that high-ranking Qing officials who had supported the Boxers, such as General Ronglu and Prince Duan, be punished. Some were executed, others stripped of rank and pension. Empress Dowager Cixi's court, already riven by factionalism between conservatives and reformers, was now publicly implicated in fomenting the rebellion. Even moderate officials found themselves tainted by association, eroding confidence in the dynasty's moral authority. Across the provinces, local officials struggled to enforce tax collections to meet indemnity payments. Peasants already reeling from famine and military upheaval faced new grain levies earmarked for foreign coffers. Provincial governors, under orders to deliver silver to central treasuries, resorted to increased land taxes, forced labor drafts for railway repairs, and corvée obligations. These measures bred resentment and occasional local unrest. Small-scale riots broke out in Sichuan and Anhui as villagers resisted exactions they regarded as tributary to foreign armies rather than a Chinese sovereign. In the imperial courts of Beijing, the credibility of the Qing regime lay in tatters. Officials who had championed the Boxer uprising as a patriotic defense against foreign subjugation now found themselves labeled criminals by the very powers they had sought to repel. Reformers, previously cautious in advocating change, now publicly questioned the dynasty's fitness to rule. Kang Yuwei and Liang Qichao, exiled scholars of the 100 Days Reform, pointed to the protocol as proof that only constitutional government and complete institutional overhaul could restore national dignity. Empress Dowager Cixi herself retreated deeper into the Forbidden City's palaces, relying more heavily on a shrinking circle of Manchu princes and protégés. Although she approved incremental reforms, such as establishing provincial assemblies and mobilizing a new army trained by German and Japanese advisors, her late-stage reforms lacked the coherence and urgency needed to reverse 2 generations of decline. Court politics, still dominated by hereditary privilege and corruption, resisted any measure that would dilute Cixi's personal power. The international community watched China's plight with detached interest. Western newspapers sensationalized stories of Chinese barbarism during the uprising, but offered little sympathy for indemnities that crippled an already impoverished nation. Meanwhile, Russia and Japan eyed the protocol's concessions for further advantage. Russia pressed for extended leases along the Manchurian railways, and Japan leveraged its new position in Taiwan to expand commercial ventures. Each power's voracious appetite for influence deepened China's semi-colonial status. In the years following the protocol, armies of foreign engineers and soldiers fanned out across the rail networks that now linked Beijing to the ports of the Yellow Sea. Telecommunication lines built under foreign supervision carried dispatches that often bypassed Qing censorship. Missionaries established churches and schools under the protection of extraterritoriality, propagating Christianity in what had been closed frontier regions. These visible marks of foreign privilege served as constant reminders to the Chinese populace that their empire could no longer stand on its own. Thus, the Boxer Protocol sealed the Qing dynasty's further loss of sovereignty. Indemnities drained the treasury, foreign troops camped on Chinese soil, and the court's role as protector of the realm was irrevocably compromised. In the hush of pre-dawn Beijing, one could imagine the palace gates, once grand symbols of dynastic continuity, now overshadowed by sentry posts flying foreign flags. For Qing China, the protocol represented not only a treaty, but a testament to an empire's fall from dominance, a fall from which it would never fully recover. Late Qing reform and constitutional experiments. As the 19th century drew to a close, reformers within China's scholar official class grew increasingly alarmed by the empire's military defeats, fiscal crises, and loss of territory. Inspired by Japan's rapid modernization after the Meiji Restoration, these intellectuals argued that China too must overhaul its institutions or face national extinction. In 1898, the Guangxu Emperor, then only in his mid-20s, boldly endorsed a sweeping program of change that would come to be known as the 100 Days Reform. Launched on June 11, 1898, the reformers, figures like Kang Yue and Liang Qichao, presented the emperor with memorials calling for the abolition of the civil service examinations in classics, the establishment of modern schools teaching science and foreign languages, the creation of nationwide railways, and the restructuring of the central bureaucracy along constitutional lines. They proposed the formation of a parliamentary advisory body, the drafting of a basic law, and the founding of model industries and banks to jumpstart economic renewal. The emperor issued edicts that abolished dozens of archaic agencies, opened new academies, and ordered provincial governors to establish experimental legislatures. These frenetic changes, however, alarmed conservative elites and the Empress Dowager Cixi, whose power rested on traditional ritual and centralized imperial privilege. Fearing that rapid modernization threatened social stability and undermined the Qing's authority, Cixi orchestrated a palace coup in September 1898. Guangxu was placed under house arrest. Prominent reformers were dismissed, imprisoned, or forced to flee abroad, and many reform edicts were rescinded. In just 3 months, the brief experiment in bold reform collapsed, leaving China more divided than before. Yet the energy unleashed by the 100 Days Reform could not be fully extinguished. In the years that followed, even conservative policymakers recognized the need for gradual change. Between 1901 and 1911, the Qing court approved a series of late Qing reforms, known collectively as the New Policies, that sought to modernize education, the military, and governance in measured steps. In education, provincial governments established modern schools alongside traditional academies. Primary and secondary schools taught mathematics, geography, and foreign languages. Normal schools trained teachers, and new technical colleges prepared engineers for rail and telegraph projects. In 1905, the court abolished the centuries-old imperial examination system entirely, replacing it with a modern degree system modeled on Japanese and Western universities. The hope was that graduates would combine Confucian moral grounding with practical expertise. Military reforms accompanied educational changes. The Beiyang Army, once a powerful regional force under Yuan Shikai, was reorganized with German advisors training rifle brigades, artillery units, and medical corps. New naval academies in Tianjin and Weihaiwei sought to build a modern fleet. Dockyards at Maui and Guangdong initiated construction of torpedo boats and gunboats under British and German supervision. These reforms were uneven. Provincial governors often financed their own militias, but they marked a clear shift from relying on irregular troops to developing a modern standing army. Perhaps most symbolically, the Qing court moved toward constitutional experimentation. Beginning in 1906, the emperor announced a timetable for consulting assemblies at provincial levels. By 1908, 18 provinces had held elections, albeit under property and literacy qualifications, to form provincial consultative assemblies. These bodies could petition governors and the court on local needs, petitioning for better schools, requesting railway routes, or criticizing tax collection. In 1910, the court promised to convene a national parliament in 1913, drafting a constitution that would limit imperial power and establish ministerial responsibility in the years to come. These limited parliamentary experiments energized a new generation of Chinese intellectuals and activists. Students at Peking University and other modern institutions formed literary societies and debating clubs, translating Enlightenment texts and studying foreign political systems. Magazines, such as New Youth and The National Essence, published essays championing republicanism, social equality, and national revival. Figures like Sun Yat-sen, already active abroad, gained greater currency among homegrown reformers who saw the Qing's constitutional promises as too little, too late. By the eve of the 1911 revolution, China's intellectual landscape had shifted dramatically. A growing chorus of voices rejected the idea of a reformed monarchy altogether, calling instead for a republic. Meanwhile, rural radicals and secret societies, inspired by both reformers and nationalist sentiments, prepared for more decisive action. The Qing court's late Qing reforms, although more substantive than the brief 100 Days, failed to bridge the gap between imperial promise and popular expectation. In quiet classrooms and in the pages of reform journals, the seeds of revolution were sown, a belief that genuine national salvation required more than incremental change, that China needed not just new schools and parliaments, but an entirely new form of government. Thus, the years from 1898 to 1911 stand as a final chapter in the Qing dynasty's long experiment with adaptability. Faced with the crushing force of foreign powers and the ferment of modern ideas, the dynasty oscillated between reform and retrenchment, achieving important advances in education, military capacity, and representative institutions, yet never fully altering the core structures of imperial rule. As dusk settles on the dynastic era, we find a China caught between tradition and modernity, its leaders striving valiantly to steer a great ship through uncharted waters, only to find the tide of change too powerful to contain. As the Qing court struggled with partial reforms and half-hearted promises of constitutional government, a more radical movement was taking shape beyond the confines of Beijing's palace walls. Revolutionaries like Sun Yat-sen recognized that the dynasty's incremental changes would not satisfy a nation galvanized by modern ideas of nationalism, democracy, and social justice. In the 1890s, Sun, educated in Hawaii and Hong Kong, founded the Revived China Society, forging a transnational network of Chinese expatriates, journalists, and activists eager to overthrow the Qing and establish a republic. Across Southeast Asia, in Tokyo, London, and San Francisco, Chinese students and merchants joined Sun's Vision Society and later the Tongmenghui, United League. They published revolutionary newspapers in multiple languages, smuggled pamphlets back into China, and raised funds through clandestine societies. Hong Kong's bustling port served as a nerve center. There, secret cells coordinated assassinations of Qing officials, plotted uprisings in southern Guangdong, and smuggled arms via steamships. Missionaries sympathetic to Republican ideals provided print presses and safe houses, while overseas Chinese merchants in Vancouver and Sydney donated silver to finance revolutionary propaganda. Inside China, the impact of these networks became clear in 1907 to 1910, when dozens of uprisings erupted in Cantonese villages and railway towns. Although most were swiftly suppressed by provincial armies, they demonstrated the depth of popular discontent. Rural gentry, disillusioned by corrupt magistrates and burdensome taxes, often backed these local revolts, seeing the Qing as responsible for repeated famines and foreign humiliation. In Sichuan, Shaanxi, and the Yangtze Delta, secret societies, revitalized by revolutionary tracts, recruited peasants, students, and disaffected soldiers, each cell pledging to strike when the moment was ripe. The Qing responded by extending the timetable for constitutional assemblies and promising a national parliament in 1913. In 1908, they created the Advisory Council in Beijing, whose delegates included some moderate reformers who urged further limits on imperial power. Provincial governors held elections for consultative assemblies, allowing property-owning Chinese men to vote for their representatives. These assemblies petitioned for better railways, modern schools, and legal reforms, and some even passed local budgets for public works. Yet these measures were too little and too late. The new institutions lacked real authority. Advisory councils could only petition the throne, and provincial assemblies had no power to levy taxes or enforce legislation. Empress Dowager Cixi and the regents continued to wield ultimate control over appointments and policy, diluting any genuine shift toward shared governance. Corruption persisted, with officials using the cover of reform to enrich themselves. The Guangxu Emperor remained under house arrest until his death in 1908, extinguishing hopes that a youthful sovereign might champion meaningful change. Reformers in the capital found themselves co-opted or sidelined. Kang Yue, once a royal advisor, fled into exile. Liang Qichao traveled between Vancouver and Tokyo, writing impassioned essays on revolution. In Shanghai's printing presses, newspapers like New Tide and Youth magazine urged readers to embrace nationalism and liberation from Manchu rule. Universities offered courses in constitutional law and political science, filling auditoriums with students debating how best to restructure the state. Yet when petitions for a written constitution arrived at the palace gates, bureaucrats returned them unread, citing national emergencies and the need for further preparation. By the spring of 1911, the Qing's patchwork of reforms had failed to stem the brewing storm. Railway workers in Sichuan had organized strikes demanding nationalization and greater local control, issues that resonated with broader calls for self-determination. Revolutionary cells infiltrated garrisons, persuading soldiers to defect if the Qing refused to deliver full constitutional government. When the Wuchang Uprising erupted on October 10, 1911, it was not the beginning of revolution, but its inevitable climax. Decades of half measures, reform decrees, and foreign encroachments had convinced many that only the overthrow of the Qing could secure China's future. In the hush before dawn, as provincial capitals declared independence, one could imagine Sun Yat-sen, then abroad, receiving telegrams that confirmed the success of his networks. Couriers had delivered revolutionary manifestos to every corner of the empire. The dynasty's final attempt to placate reformers, promises of parliaments, charters, and assemblies, crumbled on the streets of Wuchang. In that moment, the Qing's grip on power loosened irrevocably, ushering in the end of 2 millennia of imperial rule and the birth of a republic born of revolution rather than reform. Collapse and Revolution of 1911. For decades, provincial assemblies had germinated hopes of constitutional monarchy, and secret revolutionary networks had spread the gospel of republic across China's cities and countryside. Yet it was an accidental spark, the Wuchang Uprising on October 10, 1911, that ignited the tinderbox. That morning, mutinous new army troops in Wuchang, spurred by patriotic officers and revolutionary agitators, seized their barracks and raised the banner of revolt. with the signal thunder of artillery at Hankou and the deafening ring of bicycle bells calling citizens to arms, the city fell into the hands of a fledgling republic. News of the uprising spread along telegraph lines and railways at unprecedented speed. Provincial governors, many of whom had served in reform-era armies and felt little loyalty to a faltering court in Beijing, faced a stark choice: suppress the rebellion at risk of civil war or side with the revolutionaries and declare independence. Hunan was the first to break, followed in rapid succession by Guangdong, Sichuan, Shanxi, and dozens more, 30 provinces in all by November's end. Each provincial assembly issued proclamations dissolving Qing authority, pledging allegiance to a provisional government and inviting representatives to a national congress. As revolutionaries marched from provincial capitals to one another's aid, Qing defenses crumbled. The once feared banner troops, demoralized and underpaid, deserted in droves. Regional armies, commanded by reformist generals like Li Yuanhong and Huang Xing, coordinated offensives northward, aiming ultimately for Beijing. Empress Dowager Long Yu and the young Puyi, the last son of heaven, barely 6 years old, found themselves the final symbols of a dynasty that had lost practical power. In Beijing, the court shuddered at the speed of collapse. Calls for decisive leadership went unheeded as conservative princes squabbled over whether to resist or negotiate. Meanwhile, Sun Yat-sen, newly elected provisional president in Nanjing, marshaled diplomatic envoys and revolutionary cadres to present a united front. His message was clear: China must reject imperial rule and embrace republican ideals. With foreign troops stationed around the capital and revolutionaries at the gates of Tianjin, the Qing court had little choice. On February 12, 1912, Empress Dowager Long Yu, acting on behalf of the child emperor, signed the Articles of Abdication. In a brief, somber ceremony at the Forbidden City, she relinquished the mandate of heaven. Puyi and his household were allowed to retain their titles and reside within the inner court, but real governance passed to the provisional republican government under Sun Yat-sen. The abdication marked the formal end of over 2 millennia of imperial rule in China. Streets that had once echoed with imperial edicts now witnessed republican banners fluttering in the spring breeze. Provincial assemblies transformed into provincial governments, drafting new constitutions and establishing local legislatures. The Republic of China, founded on the principles of nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood, promised to unite a fractured nation and propel it into modernity. Yet the transition was neither smooth nor uncontested. Monarchist loyalists plotted in the shadows, warlords vied for regional dominance, and Beijing's ceremonial court lingered in its forbidden palaces. Sun Yat-sen himself would cede the presidency to Yuan Shikai, a former Qing general whose ambition would lead to further turmoil. Nevertheless, the revolution of 1911 had accomplished its central aim. The Qing Dynasty, beset by internal rebellion and external subjugation, finally gave way to a new era. In the hush after Puyi's abdication, one could imagine the weight lifting from an ancient land. The palace drums fell silent. The imperial banners were lowered. As dawn broke over the North China Plain, China stood at the threshold of republican experiment, its future uncertain, its past now a long shadow of dynastic glory and decline. And so ended the last dynasty, its final chapter written not with the ink of edicts, but with the fervor of a people determined to chart a new course for their nation. With the abdication of the young Emperor Puyi in February of 1912, the Qing Dynasty, the last imperial house of China, officially came to an end. After more than 2,000 years of imperial succession, dynasties rising and falling under the weight of the mandate of heaven, China entered a new political era, The founding of the Republic of China was not just a change of leadership, it was a profound transformation of China's political philosophy, identity, and direction. The Republic of China was proclaimed on January 1, 1912, in Nanjing, with Dr. Sun Yat-sen serving as its first provisional president. He represented the revolutionary movement that had been quietly building for decades, and he brought with him a vision rooted in nationalism, democracy, and the livelihood of the people, his three principles of the people. The Republic promised an end to feudal rule and foreign humiliation, and instead a future of self-governance, modernization, and unity. In its early months, the new government faced enormous challenges. While the symbolic authority of the Qing court had been removed, many of the old structures, military elites, bureaucratic habits, and regional rivalries, remained. To ensure peace and a stable transition, Sun Yat-sen stepped aside, allowing Yuan Shikai, a powerful Qing general and skilled negotiator, to assume the presidency. Yuan's involvement had been key to convincing the Qing court to abdicate peacefully. The decision to retain the Forbidden City and allow Puyi to remain as a symbolic figurehead under a generous set of conditions, known as the Articles of Favorable Treatment, was an effort to preserve stability and prevent the alienation of loyalist Manchu factions. The young emperor, now a monarch in name only, continued to reside in Beijing, a ghost in a palace of fading grandeur. Meanwhile, the Republic of China began laying the foundation for a constitutional system, including provisional assemblies, a parliament, and plans for national elections. But the early years were marked by political instability, factionalism, and the growing power of warlords who controlled their own armies. The republican ideal had triumphed, but its full realization would be long and uneven. The fall of the Qing also raised a deeper and more emotional question. How would the legacy of Manchu rule be remembered? For some revolutionaries, the Qing dynasty was a symbol of foreign domination. The Manchus, after all, had been outsiders from the northeast who had conquered China in the 17th century. The revolutionaries of 1911 often framed their cause in explicitly anti-Manchu terms, calling for the restoration of Han Chinese rule and the purification of Chinese culture from Manchu influences. Yet history, as always, was more complex. Over nearly 3 centuries of rule, the Qing had not only conquered China, they had ruled it effectively, expanded its borders, preserved Confucian traditions, and presided over some of the most stable and prosperous periods in Chinese history. Emperors like Kangxi and Qianlong were celebrated for their administrative reforms, cultural patronage, and military successes. The Qing court had absorbed Chinese customs, even as it preserved its Manchu heritage, producing a hybrid dynasty that was both foreign and native. This tension remains part of China's historical memory. In modern times, assessments of the Qing vary widely. Some nationalists continue to view the Qing as a period of decline, associated with humiliation at the hands of Western powers, internal rebellions, and cultural stagnation. Others emphasize the Qing's achievements in governance, art, and territorial unification, seeing the dynasty not as a break from Chinese tradition, but as a part of its long and evolving story. In contemporary China, the legacy of the Qing is visible in the architecture of Beijing, in the intricate paintings and porcelain of museums, and in the stories passed down through literature and cinema. The Forbidden City stands as both a monument to imperial authority and a museum of national history. The Manchu language has faded, but Qing rituals and artifacts continue to fascinate scholars and tourists alike. As China continues to reflect on its imperial past, the fall of the Qing and the founding of the Republic mark more than a historical turning point. They represent a moment of profound identity reckoning. The dynasty that began with horseback archers from the steppes ended with a schoolboy emperor in a silk robe, stepping into a new world of railroads, republics, and revolutions. and though the dragon throne was finally empty, its shadow still lingers over the story of China's path to modernity. Legacy of the Qing Dynasty. 2 centuries after the Manchu banners first appeared beyond the Great Wall, the Qing Dynasty left a multifaceted legacy that continues to shape modern China. At the heart of ongoing debate is a simple yet profound question. Were the Qing rulers foreign conquerors imposing alien customs, or had they become a genuine Chinese dynasty, assimilating into the culture they governed? On one hand, critics highlight the Manchus' origins in Northeast Asia and their initial status as barbarian outsiders. The dynastic founders retained distinctive Manchu customs, riding, archery, the Q hairstyle, and enforced policies such as banner privileges that set Manchus apart from Han subjects. Early Qing rule involved military suppression of Ming loyalists and harsh measures during rebellions, reinforcing the image of a conquering regime. For those who suffered under these campaigns, the Qing represented a foreign yoke that persisted until 1912. Yet, over nearly 3 centuries, the Qing embraced Chinese traditions at a profound level. They maintained the Confucian state rituals, civil service examinations, and administrative structures inherited from previous dynasties. Emperors like Kangxi and Qianlong sponsored the compilation of the Siku Quanshu, one of the largest anthologies of Chinese literature ever assembled, underscoring their role as stewards of China's intellectual heritage. Administratively, Qing officials conducted elaborate sacrificial ceremonies at the Temple of Heaven and upheld imperial examination halls across the empire, ensuring that Han scholars continued to shape governance. This synthesis of foreign and native elements positions the Qing as both conquerors and genuine participants in Chinese civilization. In modern historiography, many scholars view the dynasty as a Sinicized regime, Manchu in origin but Chinese in practice, whose rulers saw themselves as heirs to the Middle Kingdom's legacy rather than mere usurpers. The Qing's cultural and architectural contributions endure as tangible reminders of this fusion. The Forbidden City, the dynasty's seat of power, remains the world's largest palace complex. Its crimson walls, golden roofs, and meticulous layout embody 3 centuries of court life and imperial ceremony. Nearby, the Summer Palace and the Chengde Mountain Resort, both Qing creations, blend Chinese garden aesthetics with Manchu summer retreats, their pavilions and lakes reflecting pastoral ideals. In the provinces, Qing-era archives and local gazettes preserve invaluable records, land surveys, population registers, memorials to the throne, and compilations of folk customs. These documents underpin much of modern China's understanding of its own past, enabling scholars to trace family lineages, reconstruct historical maps, and study linguistic changes over time. Artistically, Qing patronage fostered innovations in porcelain, painting, and textiles. Famille Rose enamel techniques reached unprecedented sophistication in the 18th century, producing vases and plaques that combined technical mastery with poetic inscriptions. Court painters such as Giuseppe Castiglione introduced Western shading and perspective into traditional Incan wash landscapes, creating unique hybrid artworks that remain highly prized. Imperial kilns at Jingdezhen turned out both classical blue and white ware and boldly colored wares celebrating Qianlong's reign, many now exhibited in museums worldwide. Yet the Qing's territorial expansion also sowed seeds of modern ethnic tensions. By incorporating Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, and Taiwan into a unified empire, the Qing set administrative boundaries that persist in contemporary China's map. While these regions flourished under imperial patronage and trade networks, local identities sometimes clashed with Beijing's efforts at integration. In the 20th century, calls for autonomy or independence in Tibet and Xinjiang invoked both centuries of Qing rule and the complexities of post-imperial nation-building. Today, China's official narrative often emphasizes the Qing as a unifying dynasty that brought diverse peoples into a single polity, celebrating multi-ethnic harmony under centralized rule. Yet grassroots movements and international observers sometimes challenge this view, pointing to the legacy of colonial-style concessions and the forceful suppression of uprisings, boxers, Taipings, Muslim rebellions, and local revolts under Qing banners. The balance between unity and diversity remains a live issue in China's ongoing project of national cohesion. In the realm of popular culture, Qing-era dramas, novels, and films explore the dynasty's grandeur and decline, keeping its memory alive in the public imagination. From the courtiers of the Forbidden City to the tributes of Central Asia, the Qing era offers a rich tapestry of stories, of emperors and empresses, of artisans and soldiers, of scholars and commoners, woven through the passage of time. As we close the chapter on the Qing dynasty's legacy, we recognize an empire that was more than a foreign interlude. It became an integral part of China's historical continuum. Its achievements in governance, culture, and territorial integration continue to influence architecture, scholarship, and ethnic relations. And in the quiet corridors of the Forbidden City, or the snow-capped passes of Xinjiang, one still hears echoes of the Qing, a dynasty whose final note faded only a century ago, but whose resonance endures in the China of today. In the aftermath of the 1911 revolution, a new spirit of Chinese nationalism swept the nation, defining itself in part by repudiation of the Qing dynasty. The young Republic of China, and later the People's Republic, embraced narratives of ending the century of humiliation begun under Qing misrule and foreign imperialism. Textbooks taught that the Manchu conquerors had imposed alien customs, exploited China's resources, and presided over spiraling rebellions and foreign encroachments. This interpretation fueled a nationalist movement determined to modernize, unify, and restore China's place on the world stage. Yet Chinese nationalism was not purely anti-Manchu. Reformers like Sun Yat-sen drew inspiration from late Qing figures, Zheng Guofan's defense of the realm, Kang Youwei's constitutional hopes, and Li Hongzhang's self-strengthening projects as examples of early attempts to defend and rejuvenate China. In schools and newspapers, debates raged over which aspects of Qing governance could inform republican institutions. Provincial elections and experiments in local self-rule were, in many ways, extensions of Qing provincial assemblies. Thus, modern nationalism absorbed both critique of Manchu rule and selective appreciation of Qing innovations. This dual heritage can be seen in cultural institutions preserved from the Qing era. The Palace Museum in Beijing, established in 1925, opened the Forbidden City's treasures to the public for the first time. Imperial robes, court paintings, rare books, and porcelain collections, once the private prerogative of emperors, became sources of national pride. Chinese architects and urban planners studied Qing palace layouts to inspire modern civic spaces, while historians mined Qing archives to write comprehensive histories of the empire's governance and foreign relations. In this way, the new Chinese nation-state reclaimed Qing cultural achievements even as it distanced itself from dynastic politics. Meanwhile, the question of ethnic identity in a multi-ethnic state continued to echo Qing precedents. The Qing had governed Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, and Taiwan through a combination of indirect rule, military garrisons, and cultural accommodation, creating administrative boundaries that subsequent governments inherited. In the Republic era, and later under the People's Republic, these regions were incorporated as minority autonomous areas: Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, Tibet Autonomous Region, Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, reflecting a Qing-inspired model of managing diversity under a central government. Today's policies of unity in diversity and officially sanctioned minority rights trace their conceptual roots to Qing approaches that blended local autonomy with overarching imperial sovereignty. However, the Qing legacy also left unresolved tensions. The carve-up of spheres of influence and the harsh military suppression of uprisings contributed to recurring distrust among minority populations. Debates over the legitimacy of central authority versus local self-determination continue to inform ethnic relations in modern China. Discussions over cultural preservation, whether of Tibetan monasteries, Uyghur architecture, or Mongolian pastoral traditions, often reference Qing-era practices to argue for or against contemporary policies. In this sense, the Qing's management of empire remains an active point of reference in China's ongoing nation-building. Beyond China's borders, the Qing dynasty's global impact endures. Western historians and educators study the Qing as one of the great world empires of the early modern era, noting its administrative sophistication and territorial scale, rivaling contemporary Russia or Habsburg Austria. Qing porcelain and art continue to command high prices at international auctions, while exhibitions of Qing artifacts travel to major museums from London to New York. Tourists flock to the Summer Palace and the Grand Canal to experience the physical remnants of Qing infrastructure and leisure culture. In cultural memory, through novels, films, and television dramas, the Qing dynasty occupies a complex place. Stories of palace intrigue, the lives of concubines, and imperial romances fascinate audiences, even as historical dramas depict the dynasty's decline and its collision with modernity. The Q hairstyle, once a symbol of subservience, has been reinterpreted by young people experimenting with historical cosplay or pop culture references. This new engagement with Qing symbols reveals how a former barbarian dynasty has become an intrinsic part of China's cultural imagination. As we drift towards sleep, imagine the echoes of cavalry drums fading across the steppes of Inner Mongolia, the courtier's footsteps in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, and the distant clang of steam trains traversing Qing-built rails. The Qing dynasty's legacy is not a simple story of conquest and decline, but a rich tapestry of conquest and accommodation, innovation and suppression, unity and diversity. In modern China's pursuit of national rejuvenation, the Qing's lessons in multi-ethnic governance, cultural patronage, and the perils of isolationism remain profoundly instructive. The empire is gone, but its shadows, cast in architecture, law, language, and memory, linger on, reminding us that history's long arc bends through the palace gates as it does through the corridors of our own time.